1400 years ago, a man born here in Mecca in Saudi Arabia changed the course of world history.
If you had to rate the top people in the history of the world as leaders, the name of Muhammad would be in the top 3.
Here we have a man who began a mission. He gave light to the world.
For 1.5 billion Muslims, he is the last and greatest of that long line of prophets who have brought the word of God to humanity.
He was not just a spiritual genius, but he also had political gifts of a very high order.
He laid the foundations for a religion, Islam, that after his death developed a culture and civilization that spread around the world and inspired some of the most beautiful architecture. But today, Islam is at the very heart of the conflict that defines our world, and Muhammad's name is associated with some of the most appalling acts of terrorism the world has ever seen.
Osama bin Laden and others who have committed acts of jihad terrorism consistently invoke the Quran and Muhammad's example to justify what they're doing.
Obedience to the one true God, Allah, and following the footsteps of the final prophet and messenger, Muhammad.
Outside of the Islamic world, almost nothing is known about Muhammad, whereas for Muslims, he is the ultimate role model and his life is known in every detail. So who was he? What was his message? Why are so many people, Muslims and non-Muslims, divided over his legacy? In this groundbreaking series, I will explore the many complexities of his life story, about the revelations he is said to have received from God, about his many wives, about his relations with the Jews of Arabia, about his use of war and peace, and about the laws that he enacted when he set up his own state. I want to examine his life and times and understand how they still affect today's world, and whether they are a force for good or evil. I want to uncover the real Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. Peace be upon him. When Muslims come on a pilgrimage to Mecca, they put on 2 simple pieces of white cloth. They discard their everyday clothes in favor of these simple cloths, which symbolize purity and make everyone equal. A tradition dating back to Muhammad's time more than 1400 years ago. Just after I was born, the very first words whispered into my ear were those of the Shahada, the simple statement of faith. There is no God but Allah, Muhammad is God's messenger. Words that link me to this holy place and to the founder of Islam. Like most Muslims, the first human name I heard was not that of my mother or father, but of Muhammad. I first came to Mecca over 30 years ago as a child of just 5 years with my family on Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage. As pilgrims, we came to the Grand Mosque, to the Pbuh, the most familiar symbol of Islam. It is the place to which Muslims face every day, wherever they may be, in prayer. When Muslims circle the Pbuh, they walk in the footsteps of their Prophet Muhammad in devotion to God. People come from the 4 corners of the world, but what unites everyone here is a desire to emulate the life of the Prophet Muhammad. A man as important to Muslims as Jesus is to Christians, a man who defines who they are. But unlike Jesus, Muhammad was not the Son of God. For him, there was no miraculous birth, no healing miracles, and no resurrection after death. He was just a man. Muhammad was born 1400 years ago in one of the world's most inhospitable regions. It was a stark, harsh environment of mountain, desert, and searing heat, 1/3 the size of Europe. The vast emptiness of Arabia was sandwiched between two of the ancient world's great powers. To the north was Christian Byzantium, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople. To the east was another ancient civilization, the Sassanids, the remains of the great Persian Empire. In between were hundreds of Arab tribes and clans, constantly competing in a battle for supremacy and survival. There were very few cities. One of them was Mecca, the city where Muhammad was born. Muhammad is believed to have been born on a spot close to here in the year 570. His father Abdullah died before he was born, and his mother Amina was very poor. And what's really interesting is at the time there was no sense of the coming of a Messiah. There was no stars in the sky, and wise men didn't travel from afar in order to worship him. In fact, at the time, barely anyone noticed and no one really cared. And yet today, there isn't anything to mark where Muhammad was born. No shrine, no museum, not even a plaque on a wall. Most Muslims make a clear distinction between the messenger and the message. Muhammad may be held in high esteem, but to worship him is considered shirk, a heinous and unforgivable corruption of Islam. So, over the years, many sites connected with Muhammad and his life have been removed to ensure there is no worship of anyone other than God. The same goes for visual depictions of Muhammad. Unlike in Christian churches with their myriad images of Jesus on the cross and the Virgin Mary, mosques have no images of Muhammad or any other person at all.
What is very important in the Islamic tradition is to understand the very essence of the Islamic monotheism, what we call Tawheed in Arabic, the oneness of God. He's beyond everything and we don't represent God. But in order to be quite clear in this relationship with God, we never represent or have an image of any of the prophets. So it's not only the last prophet, Muhammad, it's all the prophets, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, are not seen and drawn and anything like this in Islam. It's out of respect towards this oneness of God and following a messenger, never worshipping him.
In the past, some Ottoman and Persian miniature paintings have depicted Muhammad, but his face was always hidden behind a veil. But in the West, there is a long history of depicting Muhammad in drawings and paintings. Most recently, a Danish cartoon portrayed him as a terrorist with a bomb in his turban. This led to an explosion of anger and protest right across the Muslim world, not just because it was showing Muhammad's face, but also because it was ridiculing him too. Despite the lack of visual imagery, the written sources for Muhammad's life are extensive. The first is the Quran itself, Islam's holy book. But there is also a rich library of stories and sayings connected to Muhammad, preserved and written down after his death, and known as the Hadith. Muslim scholars had to sift through thousands of sayings and stories about Muhammad to check their validity.
Muslim scholars themselves were terribly worried to try and verify whether the hadith they were collecting were true, whether they were false, whether they were fabricated.
The problem that scholars have with it is, one, it's only set down in writing at a much later time. The actual earliest physical texts that we can hold are actually only from the 820s. And Muhammad dies in 632, so that's a long period. Obviously, yes, of course, they've been transmitted over time, but with transmission orally over time, problems can come in.
The Arabs relied on their memory throughout history. Their history and their genealogy were all retained by memory, handed down. Muhammad was a very important man. By the time he died, he had hundreds of thousands of people following him or some opposing him. And they all said and preserved all this. And that is a source which cannot be ignored simply because some people say, no, this is just an invention or that it was written later. It wasn't.
While the veracity of the hadiths is still debated and argued over, there are remarkably accounts of Muhammad's existence from non-Muslim sources.
non-Muslim evidence for Muhammad. It's not copious, it exists. The name Muhammad is attested in Greek, Syriac and Armenian writings from, say, the first 30 years after the death of Muhammad, which 30 years after Muhammad's death is, I suppose, pretty good.
The Armenian historian Pbuh wrote about Muhammad just 24 years after his death.
The particular interest here is that for the first time in Armenian, someone talks about Muhammad and mentions him by name and says a little bit about what he did. Pbuh himself was talking about the events around the year 630, which was before Muhammad had actually died.
Pbuh gives a surprisingly accurate account of Muhammad's background and teachings.
Translating from the Armenian. At that time, a certain man whose name was Mahmet, which is the usual name for Muhammad in Armenian, a merchant, as if by the command of God, appeared to them as a preacher. Now, Muhammad gave them laws, namely, not to eat carrion, not to drink wine, not to speak falsehood, and not to engage in fornication.
Pbuh and other non-Muslim historians write about the existence of Muhammad in roughly the same time frame as Muslim accounts. Together with the Hadiths and the Quran, we have a large body of detailed facts about the life of Muhammad. We know he was born into the tribe that ruled the town of Mecca, the Quraysh, and that his family was poor. His father had died before he was born and left his mother Amina little to live on. When he was just a few months old, she handed him over to a Bedouin tribe living on the outskirts of the town, a tradition among the Arabs of the time. Muhammad had a Bedouin wet nurse and lived a nomadic life for the first 4 years of his life. Arabia at the time of Muhammad's birth was a cruel place to live. There was no law, no state, and very little peace. Tribal loyalty and customs were the only sources of protection. Justice was harsh, arbitrary, and it was swift, and the punishments were brutal. A man, for example, caught stealing a loaf of bread would be killed. And it meant that the daily struggle for survival left very little room for compassion. For most people, there was very little chance of a better existence. Muslims have a special word to describe this era, the Jahiliyyah, or the age of ignorance. This was a society that had its structures, a belief system, but not as we would understand an organized religion today.
The peoples of Arabia were polytheistic. They venerated a number of different gods. In general, each tribe had their own patron god. And that was the case throughout Arabia.
And Mecca, Muhammad's birthplace, is believed to have been the most important center of this polytheistic worship.
There was a long-established Arabian paganism, as we'd call it today, that took virtually the same form in most of the cities and settled regions. There would be a sort of square shrine in the middle, circumambulation around it, and various gods. There was Allah, the high god, and there were goddesses. But most of the Arabs were not particularly religious in that sense. This was something more for the settled areas, the towns, the agricultural settlements.
Orthodox Muslims believe the Pbuh was built by God in the time of Adam, but there is no archaeological or historical evidence to confirm its exact origins. By the time of Muhammad's birth, it had long been a shrine drawing people to the town of Mecca, the center of pagan cults for the peoples of Arabia.
Muslim sources acknowledge that the Pbuh is a central temple for the worship of God which has existed from time immemorial. So there's a sense in which the first founder of this particular sanctuary for God was Adam. And then the various prophets after kept it up, and then it was eroded away as people moved away from the worship of the one God. And then it was rebuilt by Abraham and his son Ishmael. And then again, people forgot what its reason was.
There are no non-Muslim sources which connect Abraham to Mecca, but by Muhammad's birth, the Kaaba contained the idols of over 360 different gods, each one venerated in its own right. There was a special time of truce declared every year when all the hostile tribes could come to Mecca to circle the Kaaba and worship their gods without fear of conflict. This regular pilgrimage brought many people to Mecca, and that meant trade and wealth. The tribe Muhammad was born into, the Quraysh, controlled the running of the Kaaba and so were rich and powerful, although Muhammad's immediate family were not part of the ruling elite. At the age of 5, Muhammad returned to his mother Amina and lived in Mecca, but she was in poor health. She decided to visit some of her family in Yathrib, a town about 300 kilometers north of Mecca. But as the camel caravan made its way through the desert, Amina's illness got worse. The caravan stopped here in the small oasis of Pbuh in order to drop off Muhammad and his mother in the hope that she would recover her strength. But it was not to be. After just a few days, Amina died. With both his parents now dead, Muhammad was all alone in the world, an orphan at the tender age of 6. These searing events would have a profound impact on his outlook and his personality.
And Muhammad's virtually alone at this resting place, watching his mother die. And it's only when the next caravan comes on this well-established journey that he gets reintegrated into society. It must have been terrifying and deeply poignant and disturbing.
The young Muhammad was to learn even more about loss and sorrow. He was taken in by his paternal grandfather, who died just 2 years later, before coming under the protection of his uncle, Abu Talib, a powerful figure among the Meccan elite. Abu Talib was a trader taking caravans to Syria, part of a business which from ancient times connected Arabia to the popular centers and civilizations of the Middle East and beyond. Mecca was a link in that chain.
I imagine trading caravans, picking up the spices from the Yemen or silver or the leather, bringing them to Mecca, and a quite separate group of traders picking them up and taking them to Syria, to Gaza, to Egypt, to Palestine. And all around the Holy Sanctuary, you'd have had the bustle of trading and of camels being gathered.
For Muslims, Mecca is seen as a major trading center at the time and a fitting place for the birth of their prophet. But some historians dispute its historical importance.
The Muslim tradition gives us a portrait of Mecca as this great trading city, this great pagan cult center. And the problem is that the archaeology and the records of the time do not back this up. Mecca, if it existed, was way off any trading routes, and we have no mention of it at all before the Islamic era.
This is easily explained by the fact that Mecca was in the middle of the desert, and we know that these foreigners, historians, would not cross such a hostile terrain as the Arabian deserts to get to Mecca. They kept to the sea or to the coast. And if they haven't talked about it, this is understandable. I mean, people here didn't talk about Timbuktu in the 18th centuries or before. It didn't mean they didn't exist.
The charge by some historians is that after Muhammad's death, Muslim historians deliberately exaggerated the importance of Mecca. This was done, they claim, in order to show that Muhammad was born in a rich and important city with its own religious history, independent of any Jewish and Christian influences.
I'm not saying, of course, that there was no place called Mecca. There must have been somewhere called Mecca before Islam, but it's just not very well attested. But its importance for Islam, I would imagine is something that is discovered by the early Muslim community as it develops. And by the early Muslim community, I'm not thinking of the Prophet and his followers, but rather Islam as it begins to develop following the Arab conquest of the Middle East.
Whatever the importance of Mecca, Muhammad's involvement in the caravan trade was an extraordinary opportunity. Not only did it lift him out of poverty, but it also brought him into contact with the outside world. The pace of travel was slow, through desert and oasis, through Arabian towns, and past the ruins of ancient civilizations, such as Petra, the capital of the Nabatean Arab civilization, brought to ruin by a massive earthquake. In his travels, Muhammad would have heard stories about these other peoples with their alien cultures and different faiths.
When I talk to extremely pious Muslims, they don't want any influences at all. They just want the Prophet like a white sheet of paper to be written on, by the words of God. One can still allow that image, but absolutely, for me, the caravans are vital. I mean, the experience of knowing the tribes, of dealing in marketplaces, seeing what people wanted from the world, seeing the difficulties of the world, experiencing the ruins of great Arabic civilizations, passing by the ruins of Petra, looking at the glories of Damascus. I mean, that experience of the world, he knew about the realities of what the Arab world was about.
According to Muslim tradition, by the time he was 21, Muhammad had gained a reputation for integrity and was known as Al-Amin and Al-Sadiq, the honest and truthful one. So what did Muhammad, a man entering his prime, actually look like? Although Muslim tradition prohibits any portraits of him, we do have a detailed written account from one of the earliest biographies that describes him as a little above average height. He had a sturdy build with long, muscular limbs and tapering fingers. His hair was long, thick and wavy. His eyes were large and black with a touch of brown. His beard was thick. He was of fair complexion and now ready to get married. Muhammad's first attempt to find a wife ended in humiliating failure. When he asked his uncle for the hand of his daughter, he was refused because of his lowly status as an orphan. But then his luck changed dramatically. He was asked by a rich older woman called Khadija to do some business for her in Syria. When Muhammad fulfilled his promise and brought her a good profit, she did a very unusual thing. She asked him to marry her.
His marriage to Sidna Khadija was most unusual. She was most unusual to start off with, being, a little bit older than him and also being so successful in her own right as a businesswoman. But I think it could actually be quite unusual even by today's times. I mean, it's many men, Western men, Muslim, non-Muslim, are intimidated by successful women. So I think it shows great strength of character, confidence and respect for women in the Prophet himself, that he entered into this marriage back then, and that anyone who would do so now would have to have those qualities as well.
Even in today's Islamic world, it would be unusual for an older woman to marry a younger man. But in Muhammad's day, it was almost unheard of.
In most of Arabia, women before the coming of Islam were treated as little better than animals and had few human rights. But city life, merchant life, often gives women opportunities. They quite often took an important part in cottage industries and trading. And Khadija seems to have been one of these women. She was widowed, and her husband had probably left her a sort of a business, and it was a good business, a powerful business, and she was able to manage it.
Muhammad's marriage to Khadija lasted 24 years. Despite polygamy being the norm, while Khadija was still alive, Muhammad never took another wife. And by all accounts, Muhammad never stopped Khadija from carrying on her business, an independent status most Muslim societies still struggle to offer to women today.
An older woman marrying a younger man is still stigmatized. The idea of women in business, in politics, is also difficult in Muslim societies. In the case of Khadija, she is proof that women are an equal partner in creating a Muslim society.
Muhammad's marriage to Khadija brought him personal happiness, but it did not mean that he was content with his life or the ways of the world in which he lived.
He, from age 25 to 40, should have been the prime of his life. Got Khadija, wealthy, beautiful Arab woman who trusted him. He'd got 4 beautiful daughters. He had 2 sons born of him which didn't survive. He'd become a man of respect. He was from a respectful clan anyway, but now he had the family to back him. And in a funny way, he'd risen to the top of his society and had become sort of sickened at what that meant with the sort of violence of clan society and the way that wealth could buy you anything.
The fact was that Muhammad was not happy. He himself had experienced the extremes of Arab tribal society, and the iniquities of tribal life disturbed him and made him uneasy. By all accounts, he'd reached a moment of personal crisis.
He was really upset by the bad treatment of the poor and the weak and the downtrodden people in society. There's definitely this great ontological anxiety he had about, you know, the big questions. Why are we here? What's the purpose of life? How do we make sense of the world around us?
I believe he was looking for a connection, just like Abraham was looking when he was young. Just like Moses was looking when he was wandering the valleys. Just like all the other prophets of the Old and the New Testament were looking.
Probably at the heart of it also is the most rooted issue for many who begin to question their society and even question, if you will, the morality of the society and the religious values they were raised with, which get down to the nature of God.
According to Muslim tradition, at this time, Muhammad had begun to make regular spiritual retreats. Throughout the year, he would take Khadija and his family up into the mountains above Mecca to seek peace and quiet and pray. What was Muhammad after? What was he seeking and what was he doing? He was certainly troubled, and he was seeking some kind of spiritual truth. Muhammad's spiritual retreats were becoming more intense and ever more frequent, and they were devoted to really intense personal reflection and meditation. And he chose this spot, Jabal Nur, which is a hill far up and a really challenging climb up from the city down below. And he would climb all the way to the very top, to a cave known as Ghahira. And it was there that he would spend hours, in fact, whole days and nights, in ever more intense and fervent meditation. Until one day, in the year 610, something happened that would transform not just his life, but the entire history of the world. According to Muslim tradition, Muhammad was meditating as usual, and he fell asleep. But then suddenly, he awoke in abject terror. His body was shaking uncontrollably. He later described the experience as if an angel had him in such a tight, suffocating embrace that he felt that his life was being squeezed out of him. As he lay there, completely shattered, Muhammad heard one voice, and it commanded him with one word: Iqra, read. But Muhammad replied, I can't. I'm not one of those who read. The voice returned for a second time. Read. Muhammad replied, I'm not one of those who read. Then the voice returned for a third time. Read. And on this third command, Muhammad replied, what shall I read?
اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم.
He was able to hear the divine message. And it's quite clear that revelation, some of the prophets of Israel had this experience too, is devastating. Not a nice peaceful experience, but something that racks them in every limb. Prophet Jeremiah cried aloud, "Ah, God, God, you know, I can't speak, I'm a child. Your revelation hurts me in every limb." Isaiah, when he saw his vision of God in the temple, said, "I'm dead. I've looked on the Lord of hosts. This is a lethal power." Because the impact of what's coming through is shattering. Your world goes. The world as it was before goes.
You have an essence of the divine power, which you have to articulate. That's the role of prophets, into the language of your time, into the metaphors of your time, so that people around you can understand this completely unworldly experience you have. And for me, the prophet has got that sort of terrifying, brief access to divine power. And he's using that consciousness that sort of flooded into his body and creating the words.
This is the defining moment in Muhammad's life, and today for the 1.5 billion people all around the world who follow him, completely accepting his revelation defines what it means to be a Muslim. And yet, at the time of the first revelation at the cave of Hira, Muhammad's reaction was very different. Muhammad ran to his beloved wife. "Khadija, oh Khadija," he said, "cover me, cover me. What has happened to me? I fear for myself." Khadija took her cloak and covered his exhausted body. And then, with all of his doubts, she was the one who reassured him about his experience. Khadija's words not only calmed Muhammad, but they also helped him reconcile himself with what had happened. The seeker had finally found what he was looking for. But then, nothing. Muhammad's first blinding revelation was followed by a long silence that threw him into complete crisis. Had he been deluded after all? Was the revelation just meaningless hysteria? Had Muhammad the Seeker been abandoned by God?
He was absolutely in despair. I mean, one of the sources says he was so despairing, he almost flung himself off the top of the mountain.
Days of silence became weeks, then months. All the while, Muhammad lived in turmoil, doubting what he had experienced, doubting himself. Then one morning, after several months, the long silence ended, and the revelations began again.
وَالضُّحَى وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا سَجَى مَا وَدَّعَكَ رَبُّكَ وَمَا قَلَى وَلَلْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنَ الْأُولَى وَلَسَوْفَ يُعْطِيكَ رَبُّكَ فَتَرْضَى أَلَمْ يَجِدْكَ يَتِيمًا فَآوَى.
Muhammad now began to understand that he had a special responsibility. He had a message. Like the other prophets before him, he believed God had given him a vision. His duty was to share this message, to pass it on to the people around him, to help them change their lives for the better. Muhammad's revelations would become the sacred text of Islam and what is now known as the Quran, literally the recitation. The orthodox Muslim position is that it is God himself who is the author of the Quran, and Muhammad was just the person to whom it was first revealed. The Quran is considered by most Muslims to be God's miracle. Throughout Muhammad's life, he steadfastly denied he had any miraculous powers. He insisted no extraordinary signs and wonders were associated with him, except for the words. He was just a man. The Quran, the message, was the only miracle that mattered. The spiritual power of the message is in the words themselves.
اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
Almost all Muslims believe that Muhammad was unable to read or write. His illiteracy has become essential to their faith. It is important because some critics of Islam have often claimed that Muhammad, in his travels, must have read Christian and Jewish scriptures, and so borrowed religious ideas from them, which he then rehashed as his own message. But if he could not read or write, then he was, the Muslim argument goes, pure and free of any such influences, and the revelations that form the basis of the new religion of Islam came direct from God.
It is very important for Muslims to believe that the Quran is the unmediated word of God, that Muhammad did not obtain it from Christian or Jewish or Samaritans. That is why, despite the Quran actually saying the opposite, tradition says that he was illiterate. That is also why he is put in the middle of a desert, because in the middle of a desert he is hundreds and hundreds of miles away from the melting pot of the Near East, the place where all these extraordinary religious traditions are bubbling and welling up.
To present the argument that the Quran is influenced by Judaism and Christianity is quite absurd. I mean, clearly Islam sees itself as a continuation of the monotheistic tradition. We are a continuation of Judaism and Christianity, so of course we are influenced by these religions.
The Quran clearly says that the Prophet Muhammad could not write with his right hand. It's very clearly mentioned in the Quran. And although the term ummi doesn't mean illiterate, it means not versed, it means not learned, it means a person who has not studied and learned scripture. But it has the implication of also being someone who is illiterate. But the point also is that when the angel Gabriel comes to the Prophet Muhammad in the cave and tells him read, the Prophet says, I can't read.
The Quran is as sacred to Muslims as the person of Jesus is to Christians. Whereas for Christians, Jesus is the word of God, the Logos, and for him to remain divine and pure, his conception has to be unsullied by man. For Muslims, it is the Quran that is the word of God, and so for it to remain divine, it has to be untarnished by any human interference too. So dishonoring the Quran is profoundly shocking to Muslims, as it's an attack not only on Muhammad, but also on God himself. In recent years, there have been numerous instances where the Quran has been burnt or desecrated, sometimes to humiliate Muslim prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, sometimes as a reaction to a terrorist attack. Initially, Muhammad took his message to those closest to him. The first convert was his wife Khadija, followed by family members like his teenage cousin Ali, who would eventually marry Muhammad's daughter. And then there were good friends like the prominent local businessman Abu Bakr, who would eventually succeed Muhammad as the first Caliph of Islam.
It's often said that the earliest Muslims were a mixture of young men from aristocratic families, as well as those who were very much on the margins of society. So there's the idea that Islam was a revolutionary message. Revolutionary in the sense that it actually wanted to overturn the social order, the cosmic order of society at the time.
The process of conversion was as straightforward as it is today. All it requires is the simple statement of faith in front of two witnesses. The key requirement is that conversion must be the exercise of free and informed personal choice. In fact, one of the most important people in Muhammad's life, Abu Talib, who was his uncle and the head of his clan, who protected him throughout all his troubles in Mecca, never converted, despite Muhammad's best efforts to persuade him. And there was nothing he could do about it.
The most direct, the most unequivocal statement in the Quran is there is no compulsion in religion, no ifs, ands, or buts. That is the essence. Unless you make a free choice, a free, willing choice for faith, you cannot be held accountable for your actions thereafter. That's the essence of what Islam is about.
The Quran itself is quite clear. La ikraha fi ad-din is often quoted as an example from the Quran itself. There should be no compulsion in religious matters. And the Prophet said, even vis-a-vis the pagan Arabs, lakum deinukum wali deini, to you your religion and to me mine. And that seems a very good way of promoting tolerance. But of course, throughout history, we have seen that that kind of attitude has not been respected.
The divine revelation that Muhammad was preaching would later become known as Islam, which literally means surrender. So a believer, a Muslim, is one who surrenders to God. The origin of the word is from salam, meaning peace. At first, when Muhammad began his mission to the people of Mecca, he kept referring back to the Abrahamic message of the Christian and Jewish prophets, that he was only preaching what they had preached, the message of the one true God. And he repeatedly warns against oppression and the injustices of Meccan society.
He becomes and is, in many ways, the heart of what a prophet is. A prophet is one who, yes, brings and declares God's message, but a prophet at heart is a warner, because he's a reformer. The reformer is warning the society and saying, this is a society that has departed from the straight path.
Muhammad's message was not always welcome. The rulers of Mecca, the Quraysh, disliked what he preached about equality for all. The more he preached, the more incensed the Quraysh became. So they tried to make him change his mind by offering him money, power, anything that he wanted.
To all their proposals, Muhammad gave the same answer. I haven't come here to accumulate wealth or to be your leader or to be your king. I've only come here for one purpose, and that is to be the messenger of God and to convey his word. And if you accept, it will be beneficial for you. But if you don't, I'll simply wait and await God's judgment. Now, clearly, for the Meccan authorities, gentle persuasion was not going to work. They were going to have to try something else, something a little bit more aggressive.
Gentle persuasion was now replaced by violent persecution. Muhammad's followers, especially those with no clan or tribal protection, such as slaves, women and orphans, were now subjected to brute force. According to Muslim tradition, some were thrown on burning coals, others cruelly beaten and tortured, and some women were even stabbed to death.
Now, this is because Muhammad is challenging the Quraysh where it hurts, in their purse, because the old cult is very much bound up with the whole business of Mecca. People come to the Kaaba and they come to worship in the Kaaba, and this will be really bad for trade. They are very, very angry. They feel it is a profound threat.
Muhammad and his small band of followers faced a very difficult situation. They were attacked in public, both verbally and physically, and in private, they had nowhere they could meet and pray. a million miles away from the freedom of worship that Muslims enjoy today.
This 5-story mosque and Islamic centre is being built here in northwest London, and similar things are being done almost everywhere where Muslims live in the West. And although we take this kind of opportunity for granted today, the Prophet faced a completely different experience when he first tried to gather his own Muslim community amongst his own people in Mecca. What's amazing standing here with you now is that the building of this community centre is so different from the experiences that the Prophet had establishing his own first community, where he didn't have any of the opportunity or freedom.
Well, yes. I mean, those were a very difficult time. Obviously, Islam started. Prophet Muhammad had to work very hard and not allowed to pray, not allowed to do anything what they had to do. And even if they're going for praying, they have to endure a lot of problems, humiliations there, etc. But nowadays, things are different, mashallah.
Instead of trying to resist the Quraysh's persecution with force, the Prophet looked for another way to safeguard his followers. In many ways, a far more radical step. He got them to leave Mecca, to abandon their homes and seek refuge on the other side of the Red Sea, in the African kingdom of Aksum, ruled by King Negus, a Christian. In 615 AD, a group of Muslims secretly left Mecca with their families and settled in a refugee camp in what is now modern-day Ethiopia. The Quraysh were incensed by this exodus. They immediately sent a delegation to Negus, the king of Abyssinia, in order to persuade him to send the exiles back home. Negus the king summoned the leader of the Muslims in order to explain, and after telling the king that Muhammad was in fact the prophet of the one true God, he famously began to recite a verse from the Quran. The verses he read described the virgin birth of Jesus and described him to be a prophet of God. The words worked their miracle, and Negus, the king of Abyssinia, was moved to tears and allowed the Muslims to stay.
Back in Mecca, the Quraysh began to turn the heat up on Muhammad and his remaining followers. They instituted a citywide ban which basically prevented anyone from having anything to do with Muhammad and his entire clan. They weren't allowed to intermarry, they weren't allowed to trade, they weren't even allowed to buy food from the local markets. In Mecca, Muhammad and his followers were now public enemy number one.
There was now immense pressure on Muhammad and his remaining followers to compromise their message of believing in one God only, and to give in to the Quraysh, or to at least accept some of the other gods worshipped by them. It was at this moment that an event is supposed to have taken place that would lead to a fundamental clash of values, an event that still defines Islam's relationship with the rest of the world. Most Muslims deny that this event ever actually happened, but it has been used by Islam's enemies to condemn both Muhammad and the Quran as bogus.
There are many different accounts of this story, but the main version goes something like this. One day Muhammad was sitting somewhere in the Kaaba when he received a new revelation, one which suggested that he could strike a compromise deal with the Quraysh that would allow them to continue to worship their old gods. Well, when the Quraysh heard this, they were overjoyed. At last, they thought, Muhammad was coming back to their way of thinking.
But now comes the key part of the story, which is that Muhammad is then supposed to have received another revelation that told him his apparent acceptance of the old gods had actually been inspired by Satan. Hence why these verses were later called the Satanic verses. If true, it seems to suggest that Muhammad was able to alter the divine word of God at will, and that in consequence, both Muhammad and the Quran were fake.
Now, of course, Muslims say this incident did not happen and was manufactured by haters of Islam. It then becomes very hard for them to explain, however, how it got into Islamic sources that are relatively early or are, like Zamakhshari, based on earlier Islamic sources that are lost. One wonders how it is that somebody like that, who was a pious Muslim, would have or could have picked up such a thing if it had originated from the enemies of Islam.
There are three different and conflicting versions of this story in the Muslim histories of Muhammad's life compiled after his death. There is no direct reference to it in the Quran, and neither is it mentioned in the earliest and most reliable account of his life by Ibn Ishaq. Neither is there any mention of it in the great hadiths of the 9th century. Muslims do not generally reject traditions because they're critical of Muhammad, but because they cannot be properly verified. In 1989, a storm of violent protest erupted across the Islamic world when a novel written by Salman Rushdie was published in the UK. The book, The Satanic Verses, is a fictional account of this incident, and Muslims claim depicts Muhammad as an impostor with purely political ambitions, and the Quran as the work of the devil. All over the world, Muslim public opinion was outraged.
Well, the event of 14th of January 1989 is the day when I can very clearly remember there were over 1,000 people to a minimum. And just to show that we do disapprove this material, we will publicly burn this book. And that's what we did at that day.
The burning of the book was just the start. Violent demonstrations and riots broke out all over the Muslim world. Attempts by the Muslim community to have the book banned were opposed by many in the name of freedom of speech. This issue was then taken over by Ayatollah Khomeini, the then leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, who declared a fatwa, or religious order, against Rushdie, calling for his death by any means. The fatwa has never been lifted, and although Rushdie survived unharmed, numerous people connected with the book have been attacked and even killed. A single contentious event in Muhammad's life, and one most Muslim scholars believe never took place, was being used to define Muhammad, who he was and what he stood for, and most importantly, what it meant to be a Muslim in today's world. What this whole issue did was that it highlighted a fundamental difference of views between those in the West who believed that they had a right to say what they wanted to say, and those Muslims who believed that they had a right not to be insulted.
It was a defining moment. It was the first time that the British Muslims came out as a community to assert themselves. But it was also a defining moment internationally. On one hand, they rejected what Rushdie wrote. They were united in condemning the book. But on the other hand, they were also united in condemning the fatwa. They realized what is going on in the West is not acceptable to them. But they also realized at the same time that certain mechanisms in traditional Islam were also not acceptable to them.
This incident led the Muslim community in Britain to feel that they were part of a larger international Islamic community, with Muhammad at its heart. It would also mark the start of a clash between the liberal values so central to Western identity and the more traditional and conservative views in the British Muslim community. And at the heart of this clash was the character of Muhammad himself, and conflicting opinions as to whether he was a force for good or evil in the world. Whatever the truth of this event, in Mecca, Muhammad was locked into a desperate battle of ideas between his new message of the one God and the old tribal values of the Quraysh. The Quraysh had by now imposed even tougher sanctions on Muhammad and his followers. From now on, no one was allowed to do any business with them. They were not allowed to intermarry, trade, or even buy food. But in contrast to some Muslims now, even when faced with this extreme provocation, Muhammad and his followers resisted without resorting to any violence.
In the earliest period, you could argue that a violent confrontation wasn't even feasible. You know, we were talking about tens of people, maybe then hundreds of people, but certainly not more than, say, 200 or so. And so if there was a confrontation, it would have been a massacre. And we certainly wouldn't know such a thing as Islam now.
Muhammad's stoic, non-violent resistance began to pay off. The people of Mecca started to react against the extreme measures imposed on people who had once been their clan relatives.
A huge amount of social pressure began to be exerted on the Quraysh leadership, and within 2 years after they imposed the ban, they had to rescind it. But this was by no means the end of Muhammad's troubles. What Muslims call his year of sorrows was about to begin.
A few months after the ban had been lifted, Muhammad's wife and the constant rock of his life, Khadija, died. Muhammad was devastated. She had been his beloved wife, his closest companion and advisor for 25 years. She had been the first to recognize him as the prophet of God, and had been the first person he had turned to when confronted by the terrifying and bewildering experience of revelation.
She must have been astonishing in that she was the first person to accept the revelations. I mean, you can almost say that she was the first Muslim because she believed in the revelations before the Prophet himself. And so she had that instinctive ability to recognize authenticity and genius. We see her in the sources as a very maternal figure. And this is something the Prophet had lost himself. He had lost his own mother. I mean, he really loved Khadija. You know, Western critics often sneer at the Prophet's sort of opportunistic marriage to the wealthy widow. That's not borne out in the sources. He loved her all his life. His later wives used to hate the mention of her because they knew that none of them could compete with her in his heart.
Then, a few months later, Muhammad was hit by another devastating loss: the death of his uncle, Abu Talib, the man who had protected him from the worst attempts of the Quraysh to crush him. The leadership of Muhammad's clan now fell into the hands of his most violent opponents. Attacks against him increased. His enemies now gave him a stark warning: stop spreading your message or your life could be in danger. Muhammad and his small band of followers were now at their most vulnerable. Half of them had fled to Ethiopia, the rest were almost in hiding in Mecca. His enemies were now openly making plans to crush his embryonic Islamic movement and even to kill him. The next step he would take would be critical. It would shape not only his future, but the history of the world. In the next episode, Muhammad's persecution by the Quraysh intensifies and he's forced to leave his hometown of Mecca. It also brings him into conflict with some of the Jewish tribes of Arabia, leading to one of the most controversial events of his life, a massacre whose consequences still reverberate today.
I think it seared itself into the Muslim historical memory, and to that extent it has had an impact that we feel down to this day.
Muhammad was born in Mecca in the year 570 into the ruling tribe of the city, the Quraysh. At the age of 40, according to Muslim tradition, he received a blinding revelation from God, the first of many, that would go on to change not just his life, but the history of the world. This is the defining moment in Muhammad's life, and today, for the 1.5 billion people all around the world who follow him, completely accepting his revelation defines what it means to be a Muslim. Muhammad's revelations would become the sacred text of Islam, the Quran, literally the recitation. The orthodox Muslim position is that it is God himself who is the author of the Quran, and Muhammad was just the person to whom it was first revealed. When he started preaching, Muhammad had quickly attracted a small band of followers, but they were now under threat of death from the rulers of Mecca who controlled the Kaaba, a shrine that housed the many gods of Arabia. They feared that Muhammad's message, that there was only one true God, would destroy the importance of the Kaaba and in turn lead to Mecca's economic and political ruin. By 620, Muhammad had also lost two of his greatest supporters, his loyal wife of 25 years, Khadija, and his clan protector, his uncle Abu Talib. He had reached one of the lowest points of his life. But it was at this moment that he had another extraordinary spiritual experience that would transform his life. According to Muslim tradition, one night, after falling asleep at the Kaaba in Mecca, Muhammad was transported on a metaphysical journey to a place hundreds of miles north, a city that is also holy to Christians and Jews, Jerusalem. What would become known as Muhammad's night journey would establish Jerusalem in Muslim eyes as a sacred city, a place of devotion and pilgrimage, second only to Mecca and Medina. It's one of the main reasons why today Jerusalem is at the heart of the Middle Eastern conflict.
The conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is a struggle between two peoples over the same piece of land. But why is it that this issue has become such a defining cause across the Muslim world? And why is it that the call for the liberation of Jerusalem, a city 800 miles from Muhammad's birthplace, has become such a rallying cry for so many Muslims?
Jerusalem is very important to Muslims because it represents a part of our creed and faith. The first event was the night journey and ascension to heaven, when God sent Muhammad to his night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem and ascended him from Jerusalem to the heavens.
According to Muslim tradition, Muhammad is awoken during the night by the angel Gabriel, who lifts him up onto a winged horse called Al-Buraq, and he is then miraculously transported across the desert to Jerusalem. And it's from this point that Muhammad begins one of the most powerful and extraordinary experiences of his life. He's taken on a journey where he meets all the past prophets, from Abraham to Moses and even Jesus, and he prays with all of the prophets. He's then offered water, wine, or milk to drink, and he chooses milk in order to signify the middle path he's trying to steer through life. And then a celestial ladder appears, and Muhammad begins a mystical ascent through the seven heavens, where he is eventually taken to the heavenly throne itself and is spoken to by God himself.
To modern, rational ears, it's an incredible story. But for Muslims, it is one of the most important events in Muhammad's life. Whether it can be seen as a literal physical journey or a spiritual experience has divided believers and non-believers alike.
This was a miracle, and the miracle is part of the faith. It does not have any scientific explanation, and it is against what is normal. We believe it because it is said in the Quran and in the honorable quotes of the Prophet.
I really think deeply that it was a spiritual journey, and the meaning of it is, in fact, that he went to Jerusalem and then he went very close to the one God, the Creator.
This is actually the shrine inside the rock, which is covered by the famous gold dome mosque known as the Dome of the Rock, and it's exactly from this point where the Prophet Muhammad is said to have gone on his night journey. Now, for some people, it was and is a literal physical journey in which the Prophet Muhammad traveled in the blink of an eye from Mecca, 800 miles away, all the way here to Jerusalem. But for other people, the night journey is actually symbolic. It's a spiritual journey in which the Prophet's soul enters a new realm of divine revelation.
It was highly important symbolically, because in this night journey, the Prophet Muhammad leads Moses, Abraham, Noah, Jesus, Jacob, all the prophets. He leads them in prayer, and God speaks with Muhammad. And in this discourse, God orders upon the Prophet and upon all the Muslims the single most important action that a Muslim has to perform: the 5 daily prayers.
You look for it in the Quran and you find 3 little mentions. But the whole story about the Prophet flying on Buraq, going to meet the previous prophets, going to Jerusalem, being given instructions about, the 5 daily prayers, all of this journey to heaven, journey to the glimpse of the edge of the uttermost throne of God, has all been added on later to build up this sort of wonderful cosmological gift to the Islamic world, but it's not in the Quran.
The history of religion is embellishment and interpretation. How many times should it be in the Quran? That it is in the Quran is what is significant.
Muhammad's night journey to Jerusalem and his ascension to heaven, when he meets all the past prophets dating back to Abraham, so familiar to Jews and Christians, is a crucial moment in his life. For Muslims, it is a confirmation, an acceptance by these other prophets and even God himself that Muhammad is the last in the long line of men who have brought the word of God to humanity, and that Islam and its followers were also a part of the ancient Abrahamic tradition. It was also an indication that Muhammad was now prepared to leave his tribal past behind him and bring his message to the wider world.
The Prophet's night journey goes away from tribalism. It finishes not with the tribe, but with an embrace of humanity and an abandonment of the tribal spirit and a reaching out to others. That's the theological meaning of what's happening.
Because of what happened just behind me, Jerusalem is considered by Muslims to be the 3rd holiest shrine in Islam after Mecca and Medina. And because this city continues to be under Israeli control, that's why Jerusalem continues to be such a potent symbol for Muslims around the world.
Muhammad's night journey was a seminal moment. It marked the ending of one period of his life and the beginning of another. He was about to begin a new and even more dangerously radical phase of his mission, in which he would abandon his tribal life completely. Rather than trying to defeat the Quraysh in Mecca, he would leave the city and start again somewhere else.
One day, in a place here which used to be a small oasis, Muhammad met a group of men from the town of Yathrib, which is about 15 days camel ride to the north. The men told Muhammad about the warfare and the constant feuding that affected their community. Muhammad listened to them, and for his part, he told them about his mission, about the unity of God, about the importance of living a virtuous life, and of the rewards of heaven. Now, importantly, the men sat and were even excited by what Muhammad had to say. And this was important because it was completely different to the reaction that Muhammad was used to getting in Mecca. The meeting ended with the 6 men from Yathrib converting to Islam and agreeing to meet Muhammad once again.
Conditions had now got so bad in Mecca for Muhammad, he felt that he had no choice but to get his followers to do the unthinkable, to abandon the city of their birth for Yathrib and an uncertain future in a place where they would live without any clan protection.
The community in Yathrib was made up of a number of different tribes. Some of them were pagan, the Aus and Khazraj. Some of them were Jewish. There are three main Jewish tribes. And there was a lot of disagreement, in fact, in Yathrib between different communities about how they wanted to do things. There was sort of a lot of jostling for power and prestige, and they felt that they needed a mediator. And they had heard about Muhammad, who at that time was a preacher in Mecca, growing reputation in that part of the peninsula. And they perceived in him someone who could perhaps mediate in their disputes and be a sort of neutral arbiter and come and help them resolve the problems within Yathrib.
It wasn't until the following year that an even bigger delegation came all the way from Yathrib seeking out another meeting with the Prophet Muhammad. And this time they held it under cover of darkness and in secret. And it led to a unity between the two, between the Prophet Muhammad and the community in Yathrib. I am of you and you are of me, Muhammad said. Now, this agreement, it's important to bear in mind, was something really new, something that was a radical departure, because it wasn't based on clan alliances, on family, or on tribal allegiances. It was based on something far more universal that went way beyond kinship.
It is an act of extraordinary daring, audacity, and genius, in a sense. In Arabia at this time, it was absolutely unheard of to leave your tribe, your blood group, permanently and take up permanent residence with another. It was blasphemy. The sacred tribe was the absolute value in Arabia. And for him to leave it like that and create a new kind of community, an ummah, a community based on ideology rather than relationship, was unheard of.
If the rulers of Mecca got wind of Muhammad's plans, the consequences could be disastrous. So Muhammad now had to get his followers out of the city without alerting the Quraysh. Over the next few months, a few of Muhammad's companions left the city each night, so as not to arouse any suspicions, until finally only a handful were left, including his faithful companion Abu Bakr, his young cousin Ali, and Muhammad himself.
Meanwhile, the Quraysh themselves had been planning, this time to assassinate Muhammad himself. The idea was that one member of each of Mecca's clans would stab Muhammad at the same time, making it impossible for Muhammad's own clan to revenge his death, as too many people would have been involved. One night, the group surrounded his house, and believing they saw someone sleeping in Muhammad's bedroom, the assassins, with their daggers drawn, rushed into his bedroom. But instead, they found his young cousin Ali asleep in his place. Muhammad had fled.
He's a very canny man. They're going to kill him in this assassination plot that he escapes from, goes on this wonderful journey with Abu Bakr. The thing I like of many, many aspects of it is that he made certain that everybody paid their debts. They were leaving Mecca, but every debt had to be fulfilled. There's an underlying Arabic code of honor feeding the division.
Along with Abu Bakr, Muhammad had slipped out of Mecca unnoticed. He was now en route to his new home in Yathrib. Even though Muhammad had fled, the Meccans were really determined to pursue him. And within hours, they were hot on his trail, and they chased him all the way through the punishing steep climb on the foothills of Mount Thawr. But by the time they reached the top, there was no Muhammad and there was none of his footprints. Eventually, the Meccans just had to give up and go all the way back down to Mecca. But all this while, unknown to them, Muhammad and his companion Abu Bakr had been hiding in a cave at the top of Mount Thawr. And when the coast was clear, they just simply continued on their journey towards Yathrib. It was now 622 AD, and Muhammad was in his early 50s. He had grown up in Mecca as an orphan. He had experienced some of the wider world with his uncle on many caravan trading trips. He had been married and had a family. He had received a series of divine revelations but had been rejected by his own tribe. For over 10 years, he and his small band of about 200 followers had suffered extreme humiliation and persecution. Finally, with people plotting to assassinate him, he had fled his home to a place completely unknown to him. This event became known as the Hijra, literally a cutting off from the past. There was now no way back for Muhammad and his new movement.
He went as he'd preacher. He didn't go as a conqueror. They said, come here and be our judge. We're not going to accept you as prophet of God. We're just going to accept you as a prophet, a revered man whose word we trust. He didn't come with a conquering army. He came as a refugee, as an exile, as a dignified man of respect.
Muhammad was preaching Islam in Mecca for 13 years. He only had 150 followers, max. He is a very good calculator. He knew if he fought them from inside Mecca, he was going to lose. He left at the right time because he wanted to expand his message, and he went to the perfect location where he can actually hurt the Mecca people and conquer Mecca from outside, not from inside.
The Hijra, or migration from Mecca to Yathrib, is the turning point, if you like, in Muhammad's life.
The Hijra is so important in Muhammad's life and the history of Islam itself that the year in which it took place is the starting point for the traditional Islamic calendar. All Islamic religious festivals and events are still fixed using this calendar, dating back to the moment Muhammad left Mecca in 622 AD.
I think it's of great theological significance that this marks the beginning of the Muslim era. The Muslim era does not begin as the Christian era with the birth of the Prophet, but with the date of the Hijra. This break with the tribal spirit is being undertaken.
When Muhammad and his followers first came here, what they found was nothing like the city of Mecca that they had left. Yathrib, as it was then known, was basically a large oasis, a series of villages, each village dominated by a different tribe. It was a situation that inevitably led to intense rivalries and conflict.
Yathrib would later have its name changed in honor of Muhammad. It became known as Madinat al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet, or Medina for short.
They arrived with nothing, and they immediately had to integrate themselves from being a great trading Meccan aristocracy to being poor, penniless, wearing the rags of their clothing in a very, very wealthy oasis, full of its own wealth hierarchies. They ground corn, they wove mats, and they fitted in.
When Muhammad came to Medina, what kind of a place was Medina?
Okay, Medina at that time, it wasn't a complete city. It was what you call sub-communities.
Collection of different tribes
Yes.
and communities. Yeah.
The center of Medina, which were the Prophet and the main of Al-Ansar, or the people of
followers.
Medina.
Yeah.
And then you have people in Quba, you have people in Al-Qiblatain, and then you have the Jew, the east of Medina, and also in the south of Medina. So you have tribes surrounding Medina, but as a general, they call it Medina.
Muhammad's newfound freedom allowed him to build his own mosque. It became almost an extension of his own home.
Tell me about when the Prophet Muhammad built his first mosque here in Medina.
He found the land in the center of Medina, and he built this mosque.
But this mosque, the model that you have here, is very different from the one that is in Medina now, which is one of the biggest and grandest mosques in the world.
Yeah.
This is very simple.
Yeah, because at that time, try to imagine, you are talking about 14 centuries before. The building was very simple, about 35 meter by 35 meter. But it was similar to the building around Medina, which was built by mud and also stones in foundation. and palm trees so they can cover part of the mosque, and they make an open area in the back of the mosque.
Now, that same mosque has been transformed into this, one of the biggest in the world, able to hold up to 500,000 worshippers at any one time.
Muhammad used his mosque like a community center. He not only preached here, but also made it his office, where he could settle disputes, hold negotiations, and have public debates. Everyone was free to enter and speak with him. Jews, Christians, non-believers, even slaves. Above all, he and his followers could now come to the mosque and worship in relative peace. But they faced one practical problem. There was no effective means to tell people when it was time to pray.
According to tradition, one day the Prophet Muhammad gathered everyone here in the courtyard of his mosque, where they wanted to discuss how the faithful should be called to prayer. Should it be like the Christians at the time using bells, or the Jews who used the horn, or should it be something else like using fire beacons? Eventually, after much discussion, it was decided that the new religion of Islam should be proclaimed with the human voice itself.
The man Muhammad picked as the first person to announce the call for prayers was a very symbolic choice. Bilal, a freed African slave who had endured the most brutal persecution in Mecca. In Muhammad's time, slavery existed all over Arabia, and although he never abolished it, Muhammad and his companions did free slaves like Bilal. Every day, Bilal would climb to the rooftop of the mosque, and in a loud voice, he would call the faithful to prayer. This call to prayer has since become an integral part of Muslim life. Although the words used are the same the world over, each call has a distinctive sound, characteristic to its place. The mosque and its later distinctive tower or minaret would become one of the most identifiable Islamic symbols.
A mosque is not just a place of worship. A mosque is a focal point of community. It is a place where the transformative mission of Islam must be put into practice by services for the needy, services for the community, services to help people to achieve the objectives of Islam. It's a centre for education. That's what a mosque should be. It's not what an awful lot of mosques are today. And the other thing is that mosques have to be welcoming, open places, not just for Muslims, because the transformative mission, the social objectives of Islam don't belong just to Muslims, they are for everybody.
But Muhammad was now not only the prophet of a new religion, he was also effectively the political leader of the community here in Medina. And he fused these two roles right here in the courtyard of his mosque where he spent most of his days. Now, as his role grew, Muhammad decided that what he really needed was an agreement that would not only formalize his role in Medina, but also his relationship with the various tribes. It became known as the Constitution of Medina and is thought to be one of the earliest written constitutions anywhere in the world.
This was the first attempt in Arabia to form a state based not on tribal ties, but mutual interest. To do it, Muhammad had to win over the trust of both the pagan and Jewish tribes and make them work with each other and with his newly arrived Muslim community. Prince Hassan bin Talal of the Jordanian royal family is an expert on the Constitution of Medina.
The constitution was necessary for the establishment of a new diverse state in Medina, that is to say, Muslims, Jews, Christians. So it organized the relationship between Muslims, Jews, and non-Muslims on the basis of a recognition of the importance of respecting the lives, the properties, the places of worship, and in particular, ultimately, in respecting the relationship between the descendants of Abraham. It regulated rights and obligations. In a sense, it was a Magna Carta, if you will, of the Muslims. In the case of Medina, this was not a religious state. On the contrary, it was a civil state, and the government and the people were subject to the rule of law, which recognized their respective rights and encouraged them to live together.
No complete copies of the original document have survived, and although a number of versions are found in early Muslim sources written about 100 years after Muhammad's death, some historians doubt its very existence.
Was there a Treaty of Medina? We only know this from one set of sources, which had their particular biases, their particular agendas. There are some historians who have the view that there wasn't a constitution at all and there wasn't a treaty, but that this was something made up subsequently. The job of the historian in those circumstances is extremely difficult. According to the Muslim chroniclers, there certainly was a treaty and there was a constitution. Incidentally, if you look at the constitution, there's nothing in that that would surprise you if you've immersed yourself in the political sociology of that period. It's absolutely unsurprising.
Thank you very much.
The Arabic used in it is very archaic. There is every reason to assume that this is a surviving document from that period, and it deals essentially with exactly sort of practical things that you would imagine. What is going to be the position of Muhammad with regard to the tribes in Medina, with regard to the property of the people of Medina, and so on. It's a very it's not a blueprint for an empire.
The Constitution of Medina is the earliest known model of governance in Islam, and it clearly lays out the duties and the rights of citizens, as well as the responsibilities of those that govern them. For example, it clearly does away with the whole customary practice of vengeance and the practice of private justice, and establishes the rule of law.
This constitution, all the tribes of Medina, they sign it together.
Including the Jews, including the pagans?
Include everyone. They sign it to call what they call it Ummah. The
community.
Yeah, everyone is responsible for the protection of Medina, and they are equal against the law. They run a complete state with all its law. For example, if any two Jews fight each other, they will come to the Prophet and he will judge them not according to Islamic law, to the Jews' law. There is a complete court. Everything is there as a state. Right. So he built what you call it a complete civilized state in Arabia.
The interesting thing about the Constitution of Medina is that it recognized that all these people, pagan Arabs, as well as the Muslims, the Ansar and the Muhajirin, and the Christians in that city, were part of the same ummah, of the same nation. Nowadays, of course, Muslims often use the term ummah to mean the Muslim community, but that is not how it was used in that very first constitution of an Islamic state. So when people today say to me, we would like to create an Islamic state here or there, I say to them, will it be like the first one in Medina or not? And if not, why not?
Although it survived throughout his lifetime, after his death, Muhammad's Constitution of Medina was first changed and later completely discarded by later Muslim leaders.
This is one of the worst problems that we have today. To me, the most important part of the example of the Prophet and the message of the Quran is the acceptance of plurality. The need for and the realization that there are many faiths, many ways, and all are capable of being a community, an ummah together. I think Muslims marginalize this message. I think they fail to hold it as the central principle, of social existence, and by doing that, they actually defy the example of the Prophet.
Muhammad and his followers had arrived in Medina penniless, and although they were now free of the daily persecution they had faced in Mecca, their enemies still sought to destroy them. In tribal Arabia, vengeance was a very powerful motive. The Muslims in Medina now faced the threat to their very existence. The much more powerful Meccans who had driven Muhammad out persecuted his followers by taking their property and their very means of survival, were still plotting to destroy them. Muhammad had to find a way over their enmity and fast. Then, according to Muslim tradition, Muhammad received a series of revelations urging him and his followers to fight back against those who had expelled them from their homes. The exact interpretation of these verses has remained highly controversial ever since. Some have seen them as the validation for a just war, the occasional necessity to fight in self-defense, whereas others have seen them as a justification for the killing of anyone who doesn't accept Muhammad's message.
The revelation that is in the Quran in chapter 2, verse 191, and again at 218, that persecution is worse than slaughter. So in other words, if the Quraysh are persecuting you, it's all right for you to slaughter them, which leads to a kind of an elasticity of Islamic morality without any absolute other than what is good for Islam is good, and any kind of moral principle otherwise can be set aside. And so that as the basis of warfare, and also Muhammad's oft-repeated dictum, war is deceit, which is found in numerous hadith, it's unfortunately lays the groundwork for a culture that is often quite martial and belligerent toward its neighbors and others.
The permission is only this in the Quran. You are under oppression, the people are attacking you, you have the right to resist. So this is why from the mainstream classical legal Islamic tradition, it's the defensive, what we call the defensive jihad, which is you are oppressed, you can resist this oppression in the name of your rights. So all the people and some of the Muslim groups who are using this verse to say we can kill and this is a carte blanche for war are wrong. This is not what is said in the verse. The verse is they are attacking you. You have the right to resist, because at the end of the day it's a question of survival.
Muhammad and his followers were engaged in a battle for survival. He saw these revelations as justification to attack the Quraysh where it hurt most, their caravan trade with the outside world. During March 624, the Prophet heard about an exceptionally large Quraysh caravan returning from Syria back to Mecca. He decided to capture the caravan in the desert. For their part, the Quraysh had anticipated Muhammad might do this, and so diverted the caravan away from Medina and instead sent an army to intercept him. The two sides met here at a remote watering hole in the desert called Pbuh.
The two forces, the force coming from Mecca and Muhammad's force coming from Medina, meet up at the well of Pbuh. And there is a confrontation that probably only lasts a few hours between certainly less than 1,000 people, probably 300 or 400 on Muhammad's side, possibly up to 900 on the Meccan side. We're always told that the Meccans are more numerous than the Muslims, but we've no real method of knowing whether that's a historical reality or not.
What was actually happening in the battle between Mecca and Medina, in a sense, the Prophet in exile at Medina, was an ideological battle. We think, we don't know for certain because it didn't happen, we suspect that if the Meccans had won, they would have exterminated the heretics as they saw them, the Muslims, because they were too much of a threat.
The Meccans were defeated, and the threat to Medina was temporarily lifted. Round one in this struggle for dominance between Mecca and Medina went to Muhammad. By modern standards, this was hardly a battle, more a skirmish. But its significance was massive. It was the first time that Muhammad and his followers had gone to war in the name of God, and they were jubilant at this extraordinary victory over the Quraysh. Muhammad's reputation throughout Arabia was hugely improved. But for the Quraysh, this spelt shame, which could not be forgotten or forgiven. This humiliation would have to be avenged.
It meant that Muhammad's prestige in Medina, where he just recently arrived, of course, shot up, and also the booty was extremely useful for rewarding his followers in Medina, having gifts to give and so on, made his position much, much stronger.
For Muhammad and his followers, the victory at Badr had a deep religious meaning. It was a vindication of the faith that had sustained him and his followers for now nearly 14 years. They saw it as God's approval for their new movement. Ever since, Muslims have seen this early victory as a divine deliverance, comparable to the Israelites' deliverance from Egypt at the Red Sea. One day, while he was praying, following this victory, Muhammad received another revelation that would give him and his followers a more distinct identity. The revelation instructed him to change the direction in which Muslims pray, known as the Qibla. Now, originally, Muhammad and his followers, just like the Jews and the Christians at that time, prayed towards Jerusalem. So that Qibla in this mosque here faces north towards Jerusalem. But then, according to tradition, Muhammad turned the whole congregation around and made them pray in that direction, towards the Qibla facing Mecca. And for that reason, this mosque is known as the Mosque of the Two Qiblas. Now, this seemingly simple change was actually really quite profound because it marked, first of all, the emergence of a new and proud identity, that of the Muslims, which was different in how they prayed towards the Jews and the Christians. And it also means to this day that Muslims, wherever they are in the world, 5 times a day, all pray in the same direction, towards Mecca.
This change of the direction of prayer from Jerusalem to Mecca is a curious moment. And some hostile commentators have seen the early element of Islam as being too Judaizing and, drawn towards the Holy Land, and Christianizing about Islam as being a revival movement that's going to purge the Holy Land of all its problems and create this one sort of unified sort of faith, but leaning very strongly on these previous traditions.
One could imagine a process where, as Islam wants to build its distinct institutions, one of the other things that it develops is, of course, its own spiritual center, Mecca. And so one could imagine Mecca being consciously chosen as a way of distinguishing this new faith from the ones that had gone before.
But not all the people of Medina welcomed this move to create a more Muslim identity. In particular, some of the more prominent Jewish tribes.
I can certainly envisage that the idea that one should pray to anywhere other than Jerusalem would have aroused enormous suspicion amongst the Jewish tribes of the peninsula at that time.
The members of the Jewish tribes saw the new direction of prayer as an act of defiance, symbolic of their deteriorating relationship with Muhammad.
There is, as it were, a religious aspect to it and an economic aspect that made relationships between the two very difficult. The Jewish tribes were unable to accept Muhammad as the apostle of God because that went against their scripture and their tradition and so on. So there's a fundamental problem there. But the other thing was just control of trade and resources. There's a lot of struggle for the control of the economy, if you like, the silver market and metalwork and things like that. The newly arrived followers of Muhammad from Mecca were keen to dominate the local economy.
The more powerful and successful Muhammad became, the more his relations with the Jewish tribes worsened. He expected their support in his conflict with Mecca, but they had lucrative commercial ties with the Quraysh in Mecca, which they were not about to give up. And so, according to Muslim tradition, the Jewish tribes began to have secret meetings with Muhammad's enemies. Some of the pagan tribes that had converted to Islam also started to resent Muhammad's success, and they too began to turn against him. Muhammad now faced a dual threat from both inside and outside his own ranks.
It wasn't long after the Battle of Badr that Muhammad began to encounter his first serious problems with the Jewish tribes from Medina. He learned of a series of secret meetings between the Jewish tribes and his Quraysh enemies from Mecca. Muhammad's fear was that if the Quraysh attacked, the Jewish tribes may well swap sides wholesale and help to crush him. And thus he felt he had to act. He surrounded one of the villages of the Jewish tribe south of Medina, and after a 2-week siege, they surrendered, and then they were banished en masse from Medina.
Part of the constitution of Medina had been a compact in which people of different tribes and faiths could live together, that Jews had a right to live and function within the society commercially, to practice their faith, but that what they owed the state was their loyalty. And what happens at a certain point is that the Jews, not all of the Jews, but particular groups of Jews, are seen as, in effect, committing treason, as aligning themselves and making vulnerable the Medinan community, aligning themselves with the enemy.
The exact nature of the relationship between Muhammad and the Jewish tribes is another controversial aspect of his life. Most Muslim scholars regard the Constitution of Medina as a formal treaty between the two, and that when some of the Jewish tribes met with Muhammad's enemies, they broke that treaty. Others dispute this interpretation.
You speak about controversies or differences of opinion about the Treaty of Medina. Spell it out.
This is a dispute that I don't think historians can solve. It's interesting that we don't really have any reliable, independent, contemporary Jewish sources for this. So you can take the view that they did enter into a treaty and then they broke it, or you can take the view that the treaty was a Muslim chronicler's invention in order to justify ex post facto what had happened.
There's a spark of realpolitik, of power politics, by expelling these very wealthy communities who had put themselves, in each case, in a treasonable situation. On one level, the Prophet came with a whole lot of penniless migrant refugees, and certainly when the first Jewish clan who owned all this property, owned all the valleys, when they had broken the pact and negotiated with an outsider, they meant the whole point of him coming to Medina was that he was going to be the chair and stop all of this schism.
At that time, the acceptable punishment for treason was death. So the fact that Muhammad only banished this Jewish tribe from Medina might suggest he was still hoping for some kind of reconciliation with the others. But relations between the two sides remained fraught. Another event was to increase the tension even more. Almost exactly a year after the Battle of Badr, the Quraysh returned to Medina looking for vengeance with a new army 3 times larger than Muhammad's. This was no longer a tribal squabble, but an all-out war of extermination.
Once again, Muhammad decided to meet the Meccan forces outside of the oasis here at Mount Uhud. But his forces were greatly depleted. For one thing, the Jewish tribes decided not to fight because it was the Sabbath. And one of Muhammad's commanders deserted him, taking 300 soldiers with him. The Meccans, on the other hand, were motivated by the desire for vengeance.
This time, neither side was able to deliver a crushing blow, and the battle ended in a stalemate.
It was a hard-fought battle. It was a draw, if you like. But the important thing was that the Muslim community of Muhammad in Medina survived.
The crucial difference was that this time the Meccans had some inside help. According to Muslim tradition, some of the Jewish tribes in Medina were now actively helping Muhammad's enemies. The third and final battle took place in 627 AD, 5 years after Muhammad had moved to Medina, when the Quraysh returned with a massive army of 10,000 warriors. Muhammad could only muster a force of 3,000, and so this time there was no question of him facing the Quraysh in open battle. So he decided to fortify Medina against a siege.
Medina was relatively easy to defend because it's surrounded by volcanic hills. but its most vulnerable point was to the north. And so Muhammad adopted a very simple tactic. He dug a huge trench, and its effects on the Quraysh advance was dramatic. This area of present-day modern Medina is where the so-called Battle of the Trench took place. Over there was the Meccan army, and over there was the Muslim army, and the trench dividing the two forces. The Meccan army was said to be so large that it covered an area as far as the eye could see, but thus began what must have been an incredibly strange standoff. The Meccan army was absolutely unable to do anything. They didn't have any siege equipment in which to get over this trench that Muhammad and his forces had built. For his part, Muhammad was quite prepared to sit and wait and allow the Meccans to get frustrated and leave.
Digging a trench meant that the horses of the Meccans couldn't enter the city. And it's been taken by Muslims through the centuries as a sign of Muhammad's astuteness in ordering and commanding this different sort of defense, which caught the Meccans off guard. It meant that the strategies or the tactics that they were pursuing didn't work.
According to Muslim tradition, after 2 weeks, the Meccan supplies were starting to run out. So they asked their new secret ally, one of the Jewish tribes, the Banu Qurayza, to attack the Muslim forces from within the city. Whereas before Jewish tribes had only traded with Muhammad's enemies or refused to take up arms in support of Muhammad, this time they were now on the verge of actually attacking him.
The Qurayza were inside Medina with Muhammad and the Muslims, and they had an accord with Muhammad and the Muslims. But after they had seen what had happened to the other two Jewish tribes of Medina, the Nadir and the Kainuka, they, understandably, I think, reached out to the Quraysh and offered to make an accord with them against Muhammad.
So you have these people, part of the alliance of Medina, siding with the most bitter enemy to finish off the Muslim community. That was high treason because the Muslims, as the Quran tells us, were shaken to the foundation and thinking that it is khalas, the end is nigh.
Muslim scholars claim that at the very least, the Banu Qurayza betrayed Muhammad by negotiating with the Quraysh and being on the brink of attacking the Muslim forces, even though the Quraysh and their allies withdrew before this attack could take place.
That's the traditional explanation. He was betrayed. There is, by the way, no record of any actual attack of the Jews against the Prophet or anything like that. Now, during this siege, the Qurayza lent weapons to the Prophet. On the other hand, they probably also traded with the besiegers because they were traders.
I think the Banu Qurayza probably did side with the Quraysh. I think this would have been a natural thing for them to have done. Jews are always looking for allies. In the diaspora, a cornerstone of Jewish political theory has been you meet and make friends with everyone that you can meet and make friends with. And I think this would have been absolutely natural for them to have done this.
If this plot had succeeded, the Quraysh would have been able to enter Medina, they would have slaughtered Muhammad and all of his followers, and his attempts to start this new religion would have come to a halt. His reaction to this latest act of treachery would lead to one of the most controversial incidents in his entire life.
Muhammad ordered his army to surround the village of the Jewish tribe. They held out for 25 days before surrendering. He now faced a dilemma. If he allowed them to go free, they could join the Quraysh in Mecca and help them to crush him. Rather than make the decision himself, Muhammad agreed that an independent arbiter be appointed. He allowed the Jewish tribal leaders to choose a respected local leader to arbitrate and pronounce judgment.
It was the third time he was meeting some of the people and say, I'm going now to ask someone to judge you. Are you happy with this? And he asked Sa'd ibn Mu'adh to come and to decide. He decided that the man should be killed. And before this, the Prophet said, I'm not going to judge, I'm going to ask someone. The point is for us here is to acknowledge two things. First, it happened that men were killed, but in a situation where he spared the life of the people 2 times before, and this was the last time, and say, this is enough, because you are continuing, even though we are sparing your life, to attack us in a way which was betraying us.
He said all the fighters amongst Banu Qurayza should be put to the sword, and the women and children should be taken as captives. This is what happened. They were executed.
This is the first Holocaust against the Jews. How can a prophet order a massacre of 800 men? Even if they tried to kill him, he could have banished them, or he could have moved.
It had nothing to do with the fact that they were Jews. They could have been a Christian tribe or any other tribe. It wasn't a Holocaust. It wasn't directed at the Jews because of their religion. If that was the case, then it would have set a precedent in Muslim history, and we would not have found the golden age of Jewish enlightenment taking place under the Muslims in Spain. If this claim was true, then we would have found the position of Jews throughout Islamic history would have been very, very different.
It's this incident, perhaps more than any other, that's led many critics to brand Muhammad as a bloodthirsty tyrant, willing to use all violent means in order to maintain his rule. And it's also seen as the origins for much of the hostility in the Islamic world today towards Jews. And certainly, judging by our own standards today, it was an appalling act of brutality. But we have to see it within the context of the time. The fact that very few people were shocked by this act is a stark reminder of the brutality of the age and society in which Muhammad grew up.
I think that the massacre at that time had an impact on the outlook of Islam towards the Jewish world. I think over the centuries since then, the Islamic world has, in a sense, bought into a particular view of Jews. Now, having said that, I think there are other factors that have influenced Islamic attitudes towards Jews. But I think that was certainly one of them. I think it seared itself into the Muslim historical memory, and to that extent, it has had an impact that we feel down to this day.
In some parts of the Muslim world and Muslim communities in the West, a new anti-Semitism has appeared that claims legitimacy from the Quran. Its offensive rants are to most Muslim and non-Muslim ears completely abhorrent.
أيا يهود ألا لعنة الله عليكم أيا يهود اللهم أنزل عليهم سخطك ورجزك وعذابك.
All the people who are confusing some of the historical events with taking a position against the Jews only because they are Jews are not respecting the Islamic tradition. This is unacceptable, this is racism, this is anti-Semitism, this is against our religion. We can't at the same time say, hum min ahl al-kitab, that they are people of the book and they are following the monotheistic tradition, and at the same time have racist statements just targeting the Jews, while the Prophet, when he arrived in Medina, and this is something which is very important for us, when he started this Islamic society with the rules, he spoke about al-Ummah al-Islamiyya, the community, and he said, hum min ummatina, they are members of our ummah. Who? The Jews and the Christians. So how come he's saying this, and now we come with these statements that are completely unacceptable from an Islamic viewpoint, and we are confusing what a state, a government can do, for example in the Middle East, with what the Jews are. The Jews are our brothers and sisters in faith and humanity.
The legacy of Muhammad's treatment of the Jewish tribes in Medina is still with us today, but at the time it saw him emerge as the leader of a powerful new movement in Arabia that was gaining in confidence. But would this be his only legacy? He was now in his late 50s and for most of his life had to face brutal persecution. He'd been forced out of his hometown and was engaged in almost continual bloody conflict. In particular, Muhammad had to resolve this struggle for supremacy with the Meccans. Would that end in yet more violence, or could he find a safer future for his followers? In essence, would Muhammad be remembered as a leader and warrior who conquered Arabia, or as a prophet with a wider message for the entire world? In the next and final part, Muhammad faces his enemies one more time and wins, but through peace. And he outlines his legacy in a final sermon in Mecca.
The Prophet's final sermon sets the agenda for modern, contemporary Muslim society. It shows where we've failed, and it shows where we have to try to get to. It sums up the transformative mission that was the life of the Prophet.
Muhammad was born in Mecca in the year 570 into the ruling tribe of the city, the Quraysh. According to Muslim tradition, at the age of 40, Muhammad received a revelation from God, the first of many that would later become the Quran, the sacred text of Islam. He preached a new message that Allah was the one God, that he, Muhammad, was his messenger, and that all human beings would account for their behavior on the Day of Judgment. He slowly built up a small band of followers from his family, friends, and the marginalized sections of Meccan society. But it was not a message that was always welcome. Right from the start, Muhammad's new message brought him into conflict with the rulers of Mecca, his own tribe, the Quraysh, who saw him as a direct threat to their control of the city. By the time of Muhammad's birth, the Kaaba had long been a shrine, drawing people to the town of Mecca, the center of pagan cults for the people of Arabia. For 13 years, Muhammad and his small band of followers endured increasingly brutal persecution at the hands of the Quraysh, until they were forced to leave Mecca and begin a new life in the city of Medina. Muhammad's newfound power at the head of Medina's Jewish and pagan tribes threatened the Quraysh's status as Arabia's preeminent tribe. Several times they tried to crush Muhammad and his followers by force. In the final battle, it's alleged that one of Medina's Jewish tribes switched allegiances, and in retaliation, all the Jewish men of that tribe were massacred on charge of treason. It was one of the most controversial incidents in Muhammad's life. With the ending of the siege of Medina, Muhammad had overcome the most powerful Arab army ever assembled against him. And once again, he'd humiliated his Quraysh opponents. He had seen off all local opposition to his rule, and what's more, he'd ensured the survival of the Muslim community here in Medina. He was, by now, arguably the most powerful man in all of Arabia. The revelations Muhammad received would go on to form the Muslim holy book, the Quran. They came to him throughout his life, and every time they occurred, it was a terrifying and exhausting experience. He frequently had to struggle to make sense of them. Some came as words, others as visions that needed intense concentration to understand their meaning.
He would always say that never once did I receive a revelation without feeling that my soul had been torn from my body. He'd go pale and he'd sweat even on a cold day. It's an effort to speak the word of God.
For me, the Prophet has got that sort of terrifying, brief access to divine power. And he's using that consciousness that sort of flooded into his body and creating the words.
Muhammad is born into an age where it is taken for granted that the veil which obscures the dimension of the heavenly, the dimension of the angelic, can be penetrated by men of peculiar vision or holiness. And this is taken for granted by Christian, by Jewish, by Zoroastrian holy men. And it's why people are able to accept his assurance that he is receiving revelations from God. It is why they are able to accept it.
This kind of spiritual experience is not normally associated with Islam. One Muslim group, though, the Sufis, claim to try to replicate Muhammad's mystical experience of God through intense prayer, the chanting of God's name, and singing verses from the Quran.
When Prophet Muhammad was saying his prayers while he was mediating and communicating with God, he used to hear the divine instructions and then act. That's why in Sufism and in Islam, we also try to come close to God. Through our rituals, we try to be one with Him. Prophet Muhammad is an example of this. Whatever he did during his prayers or during his daily life is there for us to take example.
The Sufis have developed their own elaborate rituals and techniques, and here in Turkey they even dance. Although there is no evidence to suggest that Muhammad followed these rituals, the Sufis see him as an inspiration for their spiritual experience.
The Prophet as a perfect human, that's very much part of both theological and Sufi traditions in Islam. His perfection lies in the fact that it is only through him that one can know God.
At the center of the ceremony is the practice of zikr, or the repeated lyrical chanting of God's name, to bring people closer to God. The chanting is followed by a particularly Turkish Sufi practice to induce a trance-like condition through dance.
Every religion generates its own diversity of spiritual practices. Islam is no exception. We have a number of different spiritual traditions, of which Sufism is but one. Now, the Prophet prayed, he meditated, he contemplated, but he also said, pray, but tie your camel. That means praying itself is not good enough. You have to do good. You have to create a healthy, better society at the same time. Anybody who follows a spiritual tradition and does good, and the emphasis on doing good is very, very important, is in fact following on the way of Muhammad.
But Muhammad's spiritual experiences were firmly rooted in the practical necessities of life. He was not someone who retired from the world, but worked continually to reform Arabian society. Instead of simply waiting for paradise at the end of the world, Muhammad tried to create his own ideal society in his own lifetime. By 627 AD, Muhammad had become a powerful ruler in Medina, but by all accounts, in his personal habits and way of life, he remained modest. He continued to live next to his small mosque that served both as a place of worship and as a center for his work. Everyone was free to enter and speak with him. Jews, Christians, non-believers, even slaves.
If you read the accounts, it is clear that he's a very charismatic figure. He's a person that numerous people came for advice, constantly came for advice. But it was not just that he was dispensing sage advice. He was always listening to people. He comes out as a very humane and warm person.
I think Muhammad does come across in many different contexts as being quite gentle, quite reluctant to find fault. He seems a very fair individual.
Muslim sources talk of his simple taste in clothes and his dislike of gold or silk or other luxuries. He did not care for possessions and gave much away in charity or as gifts.
I haven't personally detected any sign that Muhammad was guided by power. I think his integrity remained intact. He was scrupulous over any corruption or financial issues. I think he stood out as a kind of exemplary human being who could combine that moral vision with the requirements of being a leader of a growing organization.
He's a searcher. a searcher for truth and understanding throughout his life. And he's a man who used the magic of his own language. He used the genius of the Arab people and fused it with something worldwide to make something that humankind could understand.
Muhammad received revelations throughout his life, but between Mecca and Medina, their content changed significantly.
Whereas in Mecca, the revelations dealt with inward principles of spirituality and faith, here in Medina, the revelations would be far more practical. They provided a blueprint for how one should live life on a day-to-day basis as a Muslim, from the social to the political.
A blueprint that many Muslims try to follow today.
Whilst in Mecca, he is very much a religious preacher. He talks much more about issues such as the end of time, you know, it's about morality, about justice and these kind of things. But once he moves to Medina, he is the functioning leader of a community. He therefore has to get much more involved in the day-to-day running of a community. How people interact with each other, how people manage inheritance, how people greet each other even.
The revelations could be quite explicit. All Muslims should pay a tax to support the sick and needy, or they could be general guidelines about how to treat others to promote justice and human dignity. Muhammad used these principles in deciding matters brought to him as the ruler of Medina. Over time, a moral code was revealed to Muhammad based on ideas of social justice for all. In the Quran, it was called Sharia, or the way to know God.
We have 3 verses where the concept is revealed in one way or in another, in one form or in another. And in fact, what was understood by the Prophet and his companions is that what they were trying to implement was in fact this way towards God. So this is why we have a problem of defining the word, because the scholars afterward define Sharia as God's law. But because they were jurists, so for them Sharia is all about law. But what he was doing is just promoting, you know, brotherhood, justice, equality, freedom. This is Sharia, in fact.
What is known today as Sharia law, the sacred law of Islam, is very different. It only came into existence 2 centuries after Muhammad's death, when Muslim legal experts devised a legal code to help run the ever-expanding Islamic empire. They used a mixture of Quranic teachings and examples from Muhammad's life. Many Muslims now regard that version of Sharia as the unalterable law of God.
The underlying principles of Islamic law appear in the Quran, and there are some detailed regulations related to very specific areas, such as inheritance, which you do find in the Quran. But the Sharia itself is a human edifice constructed over time. It's man's attempt to understand God's will and implement it. But there are divergent views within the Sharia, there are contradictory rulings, and so it is certainly not a code sent down directly from God. It's something much more flexible and fluid and adaptive to circumstance.
In Medina, Muhammad made many radical changes to the customs of his tribal past. He abolished the brutal tradition of blood feuds. Women acquired a share in inheritance and secured rights to own property. But the Quran also ordered more traditional penalties, such as the amputation of limbs for stealing, although there is no evidence that Muhammad ever did this. Many of these punishments still form part of Sharia law today.
There was the practice of female infanticide in 7th century Arabia. So if you had a daughter, you didn't want to take care of a daughter for 13 or 15 years until someone was going to marry her, you'd toss her out in the desert and she would die. Muhammad put an end to that. Muhammad put an emphasis on helping orphans and widows. We would look at that and say, great, that's a great teaching. But certainly we find many teachings that we would consider barbaric by today's standards. Stoning of adulterers and adulteresses, chopping off body parts for those who steal things. These are certainly things that I would regard as backwards.
Today, because we are facing the West, because we are having a very narrow understanding, we come with something with the Sharia is how we are going to implement very narrow understanding of what a marriage is, of what punishment are. I think that this is not the way. And this is why I'm saying today, if I'm speaking about Sharia, I live in the West. And in the West, we have laws where you and me, we are equal before law. This is my Sharia. This is where we have to come with a better, a deeper understanding of the very essence of Sharia.
Some Muslim states, such as Saudi Arabia and Iran, base their entire legal system on Sharia law, with punishments that many regard as medieval in their brutality. So calls by Muslim extremists to introduce Sharia law in Europe and in Britain have led to street protests and the rise of political parties campaigning against what they see as the spread of Islamic influence.
This is the problem, that in the 21st century we still have nations who are beheading people, who are cutting the limbs of people, cutting the hands and feet. There are women today being stoned to death by the government for sexual violations, not for murder. It's not for a crime of taking someone else's life, and it's just the inhumane way of killing.
All these people who are stoning the people and just starting with punishment, they say this is Sharia. I say, no, that's not Sharia. This is the way you are instrumentalizing religion for your own sake. I have one question. How have you been elected? Are you elected? Are you representing the people? Let me start with the first question, because you have no legitimacy, no way for you to implement this in the name of Islam if you are not legitimate. And many of the people who are doing and starting with this are not really elected, and they are not chosen by the people. So their own status is important. And then there is a second question. What about social justice? What about equal rights? What about education? Are you going to punish people without educating them? Is this Islam? No, Islam is starting with education. And as for the punishment, is another story. Don't start with the punishment, start with dignity and rights, not with punishment. Because punishment is the way you instrumentalize religion just to make yourself being legitimate while you are not.
Like all law, Sharia law, at least in theory, is supposed to be changing, involving institution. But what we have under the rubric of Sharia law today is actually frozen in history. It is the interpretations of jurists undertaken during the 8th and 9th century. That is what we call Sharia law. That's why wherever Sharia law is implemented, it recreates the conditions of 8th and 9th century. What the Muslims need to do is to reformulate Sharia law, and this reformulation has to be continuous and constant, because the word Sharia itself means the way to the watering hole. Why do you go to the watering hole? To drink water. It is something that we need to drink all the time. That means it has to be refreshed, rethought and reformulated from epoch to epoch.
It was now 627 AD. Muhammad had a secure power base in Medina. Although he had frustrated all the efforts of his enemies, the Quraysh, to destroy him, they were still powerful and in control of Mecca. If Muhammad was to succeed in bringing his message to all the people of Arabia, he had to find a solution to break this stalemate.
One of the key lessons from the battle for Muhammad was that he was going to find it very difficult to overcome the Meccans militarily. He had to try to undermine them politically. What he needed was to strike alliances with the other tribes across Arabia. And one of the key ways of doing this was through marriage.
For Muhammad's critics, his polygamous marriages have always been a problem. But at that time in Arabia, polygamy was the norm. And it wasn't until after the death of his first wife that Muhammad had several wives at the same time. Some accounts say 9, others 11 or 13. Some were widows, some were women captured after battles who, by marrying him, were granted their freedom. One was even a Christian Coptic slave presented to him by the Byzantine ruler of Egypt. But his most controversial marriage was to the daughter of his closest companion, a young girl called Aisha. According to some sources, Aisha is supposed to have been betrothed at age 6 or 7, then formally married at 9. Other accounts make her older, nearly 16 or 17. It's this lack of clarity that has left Muhammad open to serious condemnation from many critics.
If you're a 53-year-old man and you take a 9-year-old girl into your bed and consummate the marriage, it is not right. Not only from the standpoint of 21st century morality of the Western world, but of what one might say natural morality of most societies most of the time.
My position on this is that she was older. She was between 16 and 18 and not 6 and 9. So these are, scholars of today, but not today, in fact, the last century, trying to get the sense that might be. We are repeating this, but it's not really true. It's not something which is in the Quran, it's in the prophetic tradition, and we have to check about this. And I would say the age here is problematic in itself.
Muhammad's marriage to Aisha lasted till his death, and she later became a prominent political leader in her own right. Muslim historians claim that it was her differences with Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law Ali that eventually led to the great schism in Islam between the Sunni and the Shia sects.
The real point in this, and that is lost in all this argument, is who was Aisha, what did she become? She grew up in the Prophet's household to become a really feisty, independent, intelligent, politically aware woman, and she is a foundation of our understanding of the Prophet's life. Without Aisha, half of what we know of the Prophet disappears.
A series of further revelations defined Islamic marriage. They also provided Muhammad's critics with more ammunition, as they said that while Muhammad was allowed to keep all his wives, in future, Muslim men would only be allowed a maximum of 4 wives, as long as they could support them and treat them all equally.
We have to understand the Prophet Muhammad in the context of his time. Pagan Arabia is a place where there is unlimited polygamy. That is the normal practice. Islam comes and limits that polygamy. For Muslims, it is limited to 4 wives. The Prophet is allowed, and the Prophet is previously married up to 9 wives. He is also prohibited from adding any more to that number, but those wives that he is married to, he is allowed to keep. And there's simple reasons for that. The importance of building tribal alliances. This is very, very important. The Prophet is not only a prophet, he's a leader of his people, and building those alliances is hugely important.
Now, the justification for Muhammad having more wives is Surah 3350, which gave Muhammad, and only Muhammad, permission to marry as many women as he wanted to marry. And we have to be somewhat skeptical. So many people have claimed to be prophets. When we look at a prophet and his revelations give him more sexual partners than anyone else is allowed to have, I say we have some reason for suspicion here.
It would be entirely mistaken to imagine the Prophet basking decadently in a garden of earthly delights. These are political marriages. He marries Aisha because he wants to bind himself more closely with their fathers. He's creating a new community, not based on tribe or blood, but somehow this helps to make the transition easier if you make a marriage link.
We know from Muslim sources that some of Muhammad's marriages even caused him problems during his own lifetime. For example, when he married the divorced wife of his adopted son, his enemies spread rumors that it was an incestuous relationship in an attempt to divide the Muslim community.
His marriage to his former daughter-in-law, Zainab bint Jahsh, when he married her, it's clear that there were protests from the community, and people thought that this was a shocking, scandalizing kind of thing for him to have done.
According to the sources, Muhammad faced another marital crisis when Aisha went missing during a journey. She was eventually found and brought back to Medina by a man who had known her before her marriage to Muhammad. Again, his enemies spread rumors that something scandalous must have happened between them. According to Muslim tradition, Muhammad himself was at first unsure who to believe, but eventually, after a new revelation from God, he accepted Aisha's protestations of innocence. At that time in Arabia, adulterers were traditionally stoned to death. This new revelation defined how any future allegations of adultery should be dealt with, and surprisingly, in complete contrast to the extreme views held by groups like the Taliban.
The punishment of stoning to death was borrowed from Christianity and Judaism, from the Old Testament, of course, as we know. In the Quran, punishment for having sex outside marriage is slashing 100 times on your backside. Only if it can be proven that 4 people have seen the act of penetration, which is very difficult to prove.
Muhammad's wives lived with him in specially built rooms adjoining the courtyard of his mosque in Medina. It was a very busy public place and privacy was hard to find. With the continual attempts of Muhammad's enemies to create division, the potential for future scandal was always there, so something had to be done. One day, Muhammad received a new revelation that instructed his wives to cover themselves to maintain their modesty. This act of veiling or covering has had a profound effect on Muslim women and also how the outside world views Islam's attitudes to women in general.
There are injunctions about the Prophet's wives wearing some kind of covering. It's not exactly clear what that covering is, but it's to distinguish them. And this is all part and parcel of the difficult divisions in Medina, because Muhammad's enemies in Medina were using his wives to discredit him. And so some kind of distinction needed to be made, but veiling was not for all women.
Today, the veil is seen by Islam's critics as symbolic of its attitude to women in general and its desire to oppress them. But the more universal veiling of women did not become an Islamic custom until more than 100 years after Muhammad's death.
As far as the religion is concerned, there is a requirement of modesty for both men and women. But how you fulfill that requirement is open to debate. You know, I don't feel that I'm compromising myself as a Muslim by not wearing the hijab, and I certainly don't not wear it because I'm trying to say I'm not actually such a serious Muslim. You can't judge the seriousness of someone's faith and belief by what they wear.
Over the last 20 years, in Britain, as in many Western countries, the veil has become a form of identity for many Muslim women. Some just cover their hair, others their entire face. It is a controversial issue, with some European countries now banning women from using the veil. Fatima Barkatullah is a writer on Islamic women.
But Fatima, are you wearing the veil because you're obliged to, because of your family, or do you do it out of free will?
For me, it's absolutely 100% free will. It's very much about a spiritual journey and about wanting to be the best I can be, in God's eyes. When I'm getting ready in the morning to go out, I'll just cover what I would normally be wearing, whether it's jeans or whatever I'm wearing, with something like this.
Which is a gown, essentially.
Yes, it's an outer garment.
Right.
People call it the abaya or the jilbab. And then I wear this, which is a khimar, or a scarf. And then I wear this small face veil. This is very much my public face, if you like.
But why do you choose to wear the full face covering as opposed to this, the khimar, the scarf, which you see a lot of other Muslim women wearing as well?
I believe that the more modest I can be, the more of a virtue it is. So essentially, I'm doing it to please God.
Where do you feel this comes from? Is it in the Quran? Is it in the sayings of the Prophet?
Yes, you'll find it in the Quran. The verse in Surah Al-Ahzab clearly says, O Prophet, tell your wives, your daughters, and the women of the believers, meaning the Muslim women, that when they go out of their homes, they should wear their outer garments. And the word in Arabic is jalabib, which has 2 orthodox interpretations, actually.
But that's the point. This is all in interpretation. There isn't anywhere in the Quran which says it is a rule for Muslim women that they must wear a veil. It's in the interpretation.
As far as the face is concerned, there is some difference of opinion.
The one verse that specifically does deal with clothing actually says cover your nakedness, not shroud yourself in a black bag. Now, Muslim women have interpreted it. Muslim men have interpolated practices from other societies into the interpretation of the religion. And identity politics has a great deal to do with it. But I say women should be free to choose. But there is no compulsion and there is no requirement for them to veil themselves.
Despite the best efforts of his enemies to discredit him through his marriages, Muhammad had used them to confirm and widen his power base in Arabia. He could now turn his attention again to Mecca. In early 628 AD, he told his followers that they were going to set out to perform the annual Hajj rites at the Kaaba in Mecca. For Muhammad and his followers, the Kaaba had become central to their worship, the place to which they turned in prayer. They believed it had been originally built by the Prophet Abraham and regarded it as the ultimate symbol of their faith, the unity of the one God, Allah. But access to the Kaaba was controlled by Muhammad's enemies, the Quraysh, the rulers of Mecca. It contained shrines to the hundreds of gods worshipped by all the tribes in Arabia. Muhammad was now determined to challenge their control of this sacred shrine.
The Prophet announces that he is going to make the Hajj. Must have been astonishing, because on the Hajj you are not allowed to carry weapons. He was going unarmed into the enemy territory.
It's when, again, you touch the magic of Muhammad as a man. You know, he fought wars, and now he just said, right, we're off to pray to God.
Muhammad and the convoy of followers were forced to stop here at Hudaybiyah, which is about 8 miles outside of the holy city, because the Quraysh had reacted with characteristic aggression and they had sent a cavalry in order to stop the convoy. And so began a series of frenetic negotiations with emissaries going between Muhammad and the Quraysh. They eventually arrived at an agreement. But the so-called Treaty of Hudaybiyah, signed at a spot marked by the mosque just behind me, looked like the most humiliating of compromises for Muhammad.
The Quraysh insisted that Muhammad and his followers return to Medina without performing the Hajj rites. They also insisted that all raids on Meccan caravans by the Muslim forces under Muhammad's command should stop. In return, they would allow Muhammad and his followers to return to Mecca as pilgrims to perform the Hajj, but only in the following year. And when it came to signing the document which describes Muhammad as the messenger of God, the Quraysh emissary objected, saying that to them he was only Muhammad, the son of Abdullah. For Muhammad's followers, this was an unbearable insult. According to Muslim tradition, when Muhammad's young cousin Ali, who was doing the writing, heard this, he refused to strike out the words, the messenger of God.
Muhammad says, give me the pen, point out the words, messenger of God, and he strikes it out himself. See it as a striking out of ego there, not standing on your rights. The Quran says that if the enemy asks for peace, you must lay down your arms immediately and accept any terms, however disadvantageous.
For Muhammad's followers, the terms of this treaty, and particularly the treatment of Muhammad, were completely humiliating. It was only Muhammad's adamant attitude that kept them from mutiny. What Muhammad was trying to do was totally unheard of in 7th century Arabia. In a society of honor, traditionally blood feuds ruled the day. But after years of bloody but inconclusive conflict, Muhammad now wanted to defeat his enemies not through war but by peace. By signing a truce with the Quraysh, he had not only gained access to the Kaaba, albeit at a later date, but also extracted from them the crucial acknowledgement that he and they were now equals.
In the sense, Hudaybiyah does represent a minimal option, which is that, okay, we can't get what we want now, but we can get it in future if we make this agreement. And a truce in which people were not fighting was always preferable to war. This is again something which is chronically given, that, you know, peace is better than war. It's repeated again and again. So it very much fits within that particular type of principle.
As he and his followers were returning to Medina, Muhammad then received a new revelation, confirming that the Treaty of Hudaybiyah was not a humiliating defeat.
He said, "I've just had a revelation." He said this was a manifest victory, says the God. It may look like a defeat, but it was a manifest victory. The Quraysh were filled with all the violence of the old tribal spirit, and they were filled with contempt and pride. It was the Muslims, the spirit of peace, that filled their hearts. Sometimes this is forgotten. We hear all about Muhammad's wars, but we forget this extraordinary non-violent offensive. After Hudaybiyah, the tide had turned in his favor with a campaign of non-violence.
A primary vehicle that Muhammad did use was diplomacy at the time. He went out, visited the tribes, engaged with major religious leaders, attempted to form pacts, created, if you look at the community at Medina, created a space for other faiths and other people. But when faced with resistance or aggression, did exactly what the standards of the time would have legitimated. And I think that that is clearly there. You do not see the Prophet consistently calling for wholesale killing of all those who disagreed with him.
The Treaty of Hudaybiyah marks a turning point in Muhammad's attempts to spread his message throughout Arabia, but it also shows that he was prepared to suffer the utmost humiliation from his worst enemies in pursuit of peace. And yet in today's world, the commonly held view of Muhammad is that he is the enemy of peace, and that Islam is the religion of jihad, commonly taken to mean holy war. Thousands have been killed all over the world by groups that are now called jihadi, a term never used in Muhammad's time. And yet, these groups all claim the Quran and Muhammad himself as inspiration and justification for their actions.
It's very clear, brothers and sisters, that the path of jihad and the desire for martyrdom was deeply embedded in the Holy Prophet ﷺ and their beloved companions.
Most so-called jihadis usually refer to a verse in the Quran, now known as the sword verse, as justification for their violent acts.
If you come back to the Quran, you have these verses. No one can deny that there are verses very, very much dealing with war and violence. Now, as we have to deal with the Quran, it's an eternal book dealing with history. These verses were revealed in a very specific period of time where the Muslims were under oppression and trying to resist and just to survive. So we have to contextualize this. The mainstream classical tradition in the Shia and the Sunni tradition are saying, you can't use these verses just to promote war and to kill innocent people. This is wrong.
The interpretation of individual Quranic verses goes to the heart of this controversy. But most scholars now agree that the term jihad does not mean holy war. Its real meaning is completely different.
The concept of jihad emerges out of the Holy Quran, out of the revelation that the Prophet receives. And there are about 35 examples in the Quran of the word jihad or the term basically being used, and often in the case of striving. Now, striving can be all sorts of things. It can be striving against the baseness of one's self. It can be seeking to overcome evil and being good. It can be striving in the sense of fighting. But jihad is always distinguished from fighting, and a different terminology is used for the word fighting.
In all the battles that Muhammad fought, the rules of engagements were always carefully delineated within the context of his time and what was generally acceptable. But there are no recorded instances of deliberate attacks on civilian populations.
One of the points about jihad in the early Islamic tradition, both in the Prophet's lifetime and afterwards, is that it's a gradual evolution of an idea towards something like a just war. And the just war is a constraint on the army, does not attack or massacre civilians, doesn't kill women, children, doesn't kill priests of other religions, incidentally, and so on. And this draws on the practice in the lifetime of the Prophet.
These rules of engagement appear to have been forgotten by today's Muslim extremists. Suicide bombers kill people not only in Western cities, but also in mosques and other places of worship in the Muslim world itself. In Britain today, no Muslim activist or group will openly defy the law by accepting or agreeing to the use of violence. But over the last 10 years, more than 200 Muslims have been convicted of terrorist-related offences. In 2008, Abdul Muhid was convicted and jailed for 2 years for terrorist funding. Mizan ur-Rahman was charged for soliciting murder and jailed for 4 years in 2006. Both have now served their sentences, but still have strong views about the role of jihad in today's world.
Has the modern interpretation of jihad changed in any way? Because for most people today, jihad means just one thing, doesn't it? It means fighting and the physical struggle.
The scholars of Islam in the past, they all agreed that jihad means fighting against the non-Muslims, yes, but not just for the sake of enforcing them to be a Muslim, but to make the word of Allah the highest by removing the obstacles from the implementation of the Sharia and from the call to Islam to spread across the world.
From your interpretation of the Prophet's life, I mean, is it permissible at any time in jihad to attack non-combatants?
If I just cut straight to the point, the argument of Islamic terrorists is this. If you choose a government that represents you and they decide to bomb a country or kill people, then you have blood on your hands. It's like hiring, for example, a murderer. You know, if I pay a murderer to go and kill someone, it's not just the murderer that's blameworthy. I share that blame. So if you say by non-combatants, these people are voting for a government that is carrying out crimes, then they share the blame. And then obviously in their eyes of the Islamic terrorists, they are blameworthy.
These ideas are abhorrent to Muslims and non-Muslims and would have been unrecognizable to Muhammad. For him, the concept of jihad was not just simply about killing and war, but it was about striving to improve yourself in the eyes of God. There is the concept of just war in Islam, and Muhammad himself fought many battles, but for him, there was no justification of the killing of innocent people.
The verses of the Quran that talks about fighting and defending yourself doesn't legitimize killing yourself deliberately and killing others in that process. Remember, in Islam, collateral damage is not allowed. Intentionally bombing a group of people, assuming that your target will be killed as well as others, and the others will be collateral damage, is completely disallowed in Islam.
Muhammad's peaceful jihad was now about to come to fruition. Under the terms of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, he could embark on a journey that would take him back to the city of his birth, the city he had left nearly 7 years ago as a refugee, penniless and in fear of his life. He was now returning as the head of an ever-expanding religious community, the most powerful leader in Arabia.
In February of 629, Muhammad agreed with the Quraysh to be allowed back into Mecca in order to visit the Kaaba. The Quraysh agreed to allow Muhammad and his followers into the Kaaba for 3 days. And yet, during that time, it marked a change in people's perceptions towards Muhammad and his followers. The people of Mecca saw the Muslims enter the Kaaba and they observed how well behaved they were, how sincere they were, and it was important because it showed that slowly but surely the stranglehold of the Quraysh in Mecca was beginning to crumble.
A year later, the Quraysh broke the truce by attacking one of Muhammad's allies. It was a fatal mistake. In January 630, the Prophet gathered a massive army of 10,000 men and marched towards Mecca. The Quraysh were powerless to resist, and they fully expected Muhammad to storm into Mecca and exact a bloody revenge for the many years of persecution and war. Their control of the city was at an end.
But it was what he did next, that this, his hour of ultimate victory, that left people stunned. Muhammad declared that he forgave all his former enemies. He then said that there was to be a general amnesty, and he said that no one was to be forced to convert to Islam. Instead of revenge, Muhammad consciously chose reconciliation.
The conquest of Mecca is very important because there was a wide-ranging amnesty given, and people were given options of accepting the faith or going elsewhere or whatever. But certainly there was this notion that, okay, once Mecca is taken, and Mecca is considered to be the cultic center now of this new faith, certainly the first stage of the mission is complete, so there's no need for fighting.
For Muhammad, this was the moment he had been waiting for. He had come back to Mecca not to kill the Quraysh, but to restore the Kaaba to its role as the sacred shrine to the one God. According to Muslim tradition, when he and thousands of his followers entered the Kaaba, they destroyed the many gods and effigies placed there.
He pardons the Meccans, but he doesn't just pardon them, he pardons them with kindness, and he almost drowns their criticism with gifts. And there is that sort of wonderful instance of just the tribal sheikhs who never really opposed him, never listened to his message. All they wanted was cattle and more camels and more silver, and he gives it to them.
It seems to me that that's the heart and essence of the life of the Prophet, the moment it was building to. From what I understand and know of the personality of the Prophet, it is the most characteristic moment in his entire life. He was not a vengeful man. His message was not about vengeance, but about constructing a transformative, reformative process, building society by including everybody. So it seems to me that when he came back to Mecca, that's when I say, yes, that's the point from which we begin. That's the model we need to build on.
And then he goes home. There is no attempt to impose what we call today an Islamic state. So we're not talking about doctrinal conformity. We're talking about ending this tribalism, which sets people off against one another.
Although Mecca was now his, Muhammad chose not to move back to the city of his birth. Instead, he returned to his adopted home, Medina. And with the Quraysh defeated, it wasn't long before the rest of Arabia joined his cause.
Muhammad's bloodless conquest of Mecca was clear proof that his movement was succeeding. And what's more, his message of justice and using peace and reconciliation as a means of delivering that message was beginning to attract huge numbers of converts. In fact, tribes were beginning to convert wholesale. By 631, the last pagan stronghold of Taif fell. Now, Muhammad was effectively the ruler of the whole of Muslim Arabia.
More than 20 years had passed since he had received his first revelation. For over a decade, he and his followers had eked out a precarious existence. Time after time, they had been on the verge of destruction, but they had managed to survive through a combination of Muhammad's spiritual, military, and political leadership. And finally, after a seemingly humiliating treaty, to triumph over their enemies.
Muhammad expressed and exemplified the qualities that we now see universally are characteristic of a good leader and a leader for good. Enthusiasm, integrity, then the combination of toughness and demandingness and fairness is very important in leaders universally, and Muhammad had all those attributes very clearly. I think warmth, humanity, kindness is important too. And again, if you look at the traditions of the life of Muhammad, there are plenty of examples where he showed those kind of humane qualities.
By the year 632, Muhammad had achieved almost all that he had set out to achieve. He created a level of peace and security that Arabia had rarely known. He laid out the foundations and the rules of Islam, and he created the foundations of a new Muslim community. But by this time, he was 60 years old, and his health was beginning to fail. In that year, he came to Mecca for the last time, and he performed his first and only Hajj, the pilgrimage. And he gave what became known as the farewell sermon. Sitting here on a camel in the plains of Arafat, he spoke to a vast crowd with strategically placed announcers relaying his words. It was a deeply emotional speech in which, in his own words, Muhammad summarized what he felt he and his followers had achieved.
O people, lend me an attentive ear, for I know not whether after this year I shall ever be amongst you again. Therefore listen carefully to what I am saying, and take these words to those who could not be present here today.
You see in the final sermon this heartfelt plea from the Prophet, warning the Muslims about certain things, advising them about certain things. You can see his worries for the future of the Muslims, and that these words are something that they should take note of, and they should hang on to, and they should be aware, because in here is a very, very important message for every Muslim.
Do not therefore do injustice to yourselves. Remember, one day you will meet Allah and answer your deeds. So beware, do not astray from the path of righteousness after I am gone.
Remember what God's earliest message was to Abraham, to Adam, to Moses, to Jesus, etc. And remember that the only real reality, the ultimate reality, is the one true God. And that God is the creator, sustainer, and judge of the universe.
All mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over black, nor a black has any superiority over white, except by piety and good action.
He's saying all humans are one. God has called you from the tribalism of paganism and its pride in ancestors. But remember, all men come from Adam, and Adam came from dust. And then he quotes these words from the Quran, which really speak to our time. "O people," God says to humanity, "we have formed you from a male and a female, and have formed you into tribes and nations, so that you may get to know one another. Not so that you may fight or oppress or occupy or convert or terrorize, but so that you may get to know one another."
All those who listen to me shall pass on my words to others, and those to others again. And may the last ones understand my words better than those who listen to me directly. Be my witness, O Allah, that I have conveyed your message to your people.
And he asks them, "O people, O Muslims, have I fulfilled my mandate to you?" And they cry, "Nam." Yes, and it rings around. And he asks them 3 times, "Have I?" And each time they reply, "Nam." And I think it's a most moving moment.
Well, that's his summation of his life. So he emphasizes all the principles that he's been teaching for the last 23 years. He says, for example, there's no difference between Arab and non-Arab. Look after your family. So it's kind of summation of his life. If you did nothing else, but simply read the last sermon, you will get the essence of the life of Muhammad.
The Prophet's final sermon sets the agenda for modern contemporary Muslim society. It shows where we've failed, and it shows where we have to try to get to. It sums up the transformative mission that was the life of the Prophet.
After his farewell pilgrimage, Muhammad returned to his small house in Medina, exhausted. He had begun to have headaches and fainting fits. He tried to attend public prayers in the mosque, but he was more and more confined to his bed where Aisha nursed him. One day, he appeared to get better, and the news spread like wildfire around the oasis. But it was only a brief reprieve. On the 8th of June, 632, Muhammad died in the house of his wife, Aisha. The news stunned his followers. Some refused to accept the truth. Panic began to take hold. How could the messenger of God be dead? his closest companion Abu Bakr calmed their fears, reminding them that Muhammad had never claimed to be anything other than a mere mortal, and that only God is to be worshipped, not Muhammad. He was buried here, next to his mosque, his face turned towards Mecca, a practice still common today among Muslims.
Within 100 years, Muhammad's message had spread across the world, as far as India and China in the east, and as far as North Africa and Spain and France in the west. But in many ways, his struggle for a peaceful jihad was already in tatters. Within just a generation of Muhammad's death, his closest companions and family were already squabbling, breaking out into open and bloody warfare that led to the deep schism that still exists within the Muslim world today between Sunni and Shia. But today, Muhammad's message seems under threat like never before. Many Muslims feel humiliated and condemned by the sheer power of Western culture and military might, whilst many in the West see Islam as the religion of some of the most oppressive states on earth, a violent, intolerant faith. But the question is, how much of this can be blamed on Muhammad himself? Muhammad left the world with three things: his faith in God, the example of his own life, and above all else, the Quran itself. Now, people will always choose and highlight those aspects of his life they want to support their own arguments whilst ignoring the rest. But if we examine his life in total, we find that he left Arabia a better place than he found it. When faced with persecution, he chose to suffer rather than to retaliate. Although he fought many military battles, he turned his back on war when he could. His ultimate victory came through peace, not through conflict. And with that victory, he chose the path of reconciliation rather than revenge. And finally, in his farewell sermon, Muhammad left us with the most important lesson of all, that we are all equal, Arab and non-Arab, Muslim and non-Muslim, a universal message that is as relevant today as it was in 7th century Arabia. And it seems to me that this is the true legacy of the life of Muhammad.
Next this evening, Jazz is back and it's her birthday in Small Teen, Bigger World here on BBC HD.